10 minutes to impact. I warned you! I won't warn you again! Michael shouts through the small, retractable slide that serves as a peephole on the shelter door. Despite being several inches of solid steel, the rhythmic pounding of a sledgehammer on the other side can still be heard inside the small shelter. Outside that door, a man sweats profusely as he hammers away at the locking mechanism to the shelter door. Come on, there's more than enough room. I told you weeks ago to prepare. I told you there'd be no room with us here. I can't be responsible for you and your family. I won't be responsible. Michael shouts again through the peephole. The man pounding outside the door can't see Michael's hands clutching the old .30-06. The barrel's large for a rifle, but small enough to fit through the peephole. I've got my family out here. Public shelter's all full up. Where are we supposed to go? Let us in. The rhythmic pounding continues, the hammer pounding away at the locking mechanism, keeping the underground shelter protected from whatever might happen in the outside in the next 10 minutes. Robert, get away from this door. I won't warn you again. The pounding continues, the warning ignored. Michael turns to look behind him, nodding at Alexandra, his wife. Cover Lily's eyes. Lily, darling, cover your ears. The 8-year-old girl does as she's told, her eyes wide with panic as her mother clutches her close and puts her hands over her eyes. Michael then looks at his older son Luke and simply nods. The asteroid still hasn't hit yet, but the old world died hours ago as panic set in when the general population could no longer find appropriate shelter. At 16 years old, Luke was old enough for what was coming next. He had to be. Luke nods at his father. Michael lifts the rifle to the peephole and sticks the edge of the barrel out the other side. He doesn't have to aim, his target's so close it's impossible to miss. Bam! The rifle thunders inside the small cramped shelter, amplifying the retort to a painful degree. Luke gasps, face white with terror, but he holds his tears in, even as they threaten to squeeze out of the corner of his eyes. Outside the door, the hammering has stopped. Michael pulls the rifle back inside the shelter, grim determination on his face. He spent years in the surface fighting in the deserts of both Iraq and Afghanistan. This wasn't his first kill, but this one, it's just plain wrong. This was his neighbor. 2 months ago, he was borrowing the portable grill for a family camping trip. But that was the old world before news of the asteroid. Outside the door, there's a single soft sob, and Michael presses an eye back up against the peephole. Standing 20 feet down the underground corridor his grandfather had dug during the start of the Cold War is Carol. Carol, I'm so sorry, Carol. Listen, I begged him to stop. We just can't. We don't have enough room, and I've got 2 children. You knew. For weeks, you know we wouldn't be able to fit you in. Carol stands in shock, tears streaming from her eyes as she gazes down at the body of her husband. Carol, you have to go, darling. You have to go, and you have to find somewhere to shelter. Find a home with a basement or a parking garage somewhere, or Carol, you have to hurry, please. She doesn't reply. Instead, she slowly turns around and walks back up the 20 feet of stairs leading back up to the outside world. Inside the shelter, Michael sighs and slumps back on the wall behind him. The rifle nearly falls out of his hands. He pulls himself together. This is not a time to be weak. If they were going to survive what was coming next, if anyone was going to survive, they'd have to be strong. Michael joins his wife sitting on the floor and kneels down, gently pulling Lily's fingers out of her ears. Shh, it's okay, baby, that's it. You don't have to plug your ears anymore. Everything's all right. Daddy, I heard a gunshot. I know, baby, Dad was just warning off Mr. Trucker is all. Luke is quick to interject. His father nods his approval at him. Then he turns his attention to the shelves of supplies and equipment behind him. Luke, go and fetch that old radio, will you? Luke nods. The radio is practically ancient at this point, something his grandfather stashed away down here in preparation for the end of the world. It picks up both AM and FM and runs off batteries, which they have plenty of. With what experts on TV have predicted happening, it's likely that radio will be the only means of communication left very soon. Then again, with what the experts on TV have predicted, Luke's not sure there'll be anyone left to communicate with at all. He shakes those thoughts away and cranks the radio on, immediately picking up a station still broadcasting. Whoever's on at the other end obviously chose not to seek shelter, probably figuring there wasn't much point in it. There's many like him. Millions of people crowd the streets of every major city in the world just waiting for the end. Some of them never bothered to try and seek shelter. Some, like Mr. Trucker and his wife, were simply unlucky and couldn't find any. Is believed to be sheltering underground somewhere under the Rocky Mountains along with his cabinet and most senior members of the government. The mountains are largely made of very tough granite, and it's believed by some, hoped that it'll afford at least some protection from the asteroid impact. It all depends, of course, on exactly where the asteroid hits. Predictions have swung back and forth since discovery of Asteroid 2022, with some believing it'll strike directly on the coast of Spain, and others sure it'll strike a few dozen miles off the coast into the ocean. In that event, Michael grabs the radio from his son and turns the tuning knob. He knows precisely what'll happen in either event, as it's all the media's talked about for the last 4 weeks since the discovery of Asteroid 2022. Regardless of where the asteroid lands, humanity will go extinct. And yet, here he was, huddled with his family in an old Cold War shelter his grandfather dug with his own 2 hands. What else was he supposed to do? He'd heard reports of families taking the easy way out as soon as 2 weeks ago, but he couldn't stomach that thought. If there was a chance, he was going to fight for it. The knob finally lands on another station. "This is very troubling time, friends. I don't know what happens next. I don't know whether this is Judgment Day for us all, the end of times, or any form of the apocalypse. Whatever your faith, all I hope is that you have lived a good, happy life. And with 1 minute and 38 seconds until impact, I leave you with this. Should any of us pull through this, my hope is that we forget the things that made our world evil. War, hate, prejudice, and never forget what made our civilization great. Love, respect, and empathy. Amen and goodbye." "Amen," Michael whispers to himself as the station goes off the air, his eyes locked on the door. He cranks the power knob and turns the radio off, seating himself between his wife and his son. Little Lily is still in her mother's arms. She's been brave ever since the family packed into the shelter about an hour ago and hasn't even cried once. Michael kisses her on the forehead and then turns to kiss his son on the forehead. He puts his arms around his family and pulls his wife close for a quick kiss. "Everyone, go ahead and close your eyes. Open your mouth to equalize the air pressure and plug your ears." Impact. A massive asteroid the size of Rhode Island smashes into the upper layers of the atmosphere. Its collision course with Earth puts it on a very shallow angle, resulting in it starting to penetrate our atmosphere somewhere off the coast of Portugal over the Atlantic. The asteroid physically compresses the air in front of it, creating a superheated shockwave that rides just in front and below the asteroid. Moving at over 20,000 miles an hour, it lights up the sky over Portugal and very quickly crosses into Spain. The shockwave is so intense that as it flies over Spanish cities, thousands of people who couldn't find shelter or decided the impact simply wasn't survivable are all knocked down to the ground by the force of the passing asteroid. As the massive space rock nears Madrid, the shockwave below is so intense that people are knocked down with enough force to kill them. About 34 seconds after first making contact with the uppermost layers of the atmosphere, the asteroid slams straight into the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France. Predicting the impact location of such a massive, fast-moving object was always difficult, and the best estimates have been hundreds of miles off. In the first nanosecond before impact, the massive superheated air in front of the asteroid immediately incinerates any plants, animals, or humans within half a dozen miles. The air is so compressed in front of the gargantuan rock that it actually smashes into the rocky terrain with enough force to melt it to lava a few inches deep. Then the rock itself actually strikes. In an instant, the asteroid and half a mile wide, 300 feet deep area of rock are vaporized. Then the shockwave and heat, reaching temperatures as hot as the sun, melt rock in the impact zone down to a half-mile deep. The shockwave propagates through the ground faster than the speed of sound and completely tears apart any living thing caught in its path for several miles. The mighty Pyrenees Mountains themselves are shattered by the impact as a crater 100 miles across quickly forms, splitting the mighty mountain range nearly in two. The shockwaves continue racing out and hit the first major population centers within a minute of impact. Buildings, vehicles, and people are absolutely annihilated by the force of the shockwave, torn to shreds and tossed about like rag dolls. At about the same time, a massive plume of molten rock shoots up into the sky from the center of the crater. Trillions of tons of molten lava fire into the atmosphere and even beyond it. In space around the Earth, rocks from the impact have already been flung with enough force to eventually leave Earth's orbit. Some will end up catching up with Earth again in a few thousand or millions of years. Others will float forever in the void between the planets inside our solar system. Still others will end up crash landing on Venus and Mars, escapees from a dying Earth. The massive lava plume comes crashing back down to Earth, too hot to be chilled by its flight into the sky, and washes over an area dozens of square miles wide. Anything that might have somehow survived the shockwave of the impact will now be bathed in fiery lava as it rains from the heavens. The shockwave continues to propagate out across Europe, leveling cities all the way out to Portugal in the west and Paris in the east. In the English Channel and the Mediterranean Sea, massive tsunamis half a mile high build up and speed out at several hundred miles an hour. The water will reach all the way to London itself in the north and destroy the entire southern Mediterranean coastline of Africa. It'll even reach all the way to Turkey, where its seaside communities will be flooded with waves 3 meters high. Tens of trillions of tons of vaporized rocks are picked up by hurricane-force winds created by the impact and spread across the upper atmosphere. This will turn the air poisonous across all of Europe and northern Africa, but trade winds will eventually bring the poisonous atmosphere as far as the east coast of the US and the Middle East. By then, it'll be more of a health hazard than a deadly threat, however. But for Europeans without breathing apparatuses, their next breath could be lethal. Billions of tons of molten rocks hurtled up into space now start to make their way back down again. The meteor rain of half-molten lava will reach all the way to Asia and the United States. starting massive fires across every continent on Earth except for Australia. Millions will die from this deadly rain as it smashes into cities and towns as the deadliest form of hail humanity ever witnessed. The fires will kill anyone who survives the crushing rain. 28 minutes after impact. It starts with a slow tremor, and then suddenly the shockwave of the impact hits the family shelter with enough force to physically pick up and throw the family around the room. Lily screams as she's hurtled out of her mother's arms, but it's over in an instant and nobody's seriously hurt. Michael calms the family best he can. He's prepared them for this, and they all know what comes next. The shockwave of the impact circles the earth and hits them again. The second time, though, it was much milder, simply rattling the contents of the shelf for a bit before passing on. It'll circle the earth 3 or 4 more times, losing exponentially more energy with each pass, but still detectable on seismometers. The first rock falls with a thundering crash somewhere above, about 50 feet south of them. Michael does the calculations and figures it must have hit somewhere around the back of the house. The shelter's about 35 feet from the back porch, dug 20 feet into the ground. He's pretty sure they're safe, but as more impacts are heard and felt, he becomes seriously concerned about being buried alive. He has no idea, but it's raining mountains over the American East Coast, the Pyrenees Mountains specifically. "Everybody, hang on to each other," he shouts as he grabs onto Lily's hand and pulls her close. He then hugs his wife and Luke. The family clings to each other as the deadly rain of ballistic rock missiles washes over the community. 6 hours after impact. It stopped raining rocks about half an hour ago, but Michael wanted to be cautious. Now, well, he supposes there's nothing to do but survey the damage. He passes Lily off to his wife and nods at Luke. Reflexively, he reaches for his rifle and shoulders it. He's not really sure why, though. Maybe in case there's other people desperate enough to try to take his shelter away from him and his family. However, after hours of raining rocks, he doubts anybody caught out in the open could have survived, or anyone sheltering in the buildings without basements for that matter. He opens the peephole on the door and looks out of it. Thankfully, the tunnel leading to the outside hasn't collapsed. He was worried about that, and he had stuck 2 shovels inside the shelter just in case. The door itself takes significant effort to push open, made worse by the fact that his dead neighbor's body still lays where it fell 6 hours ago. As the pair emerge from the shelter, Michael closes his eyes. He almost doesn't want to look, seeing what remains will make it all too real. The end of the world. But he opens them as acrid smoke hits his nostrils and makes his eyes water. What he sees is nothing short of complete, utter devastation. A fiery, burning hell has come to Earth. His former suburban neighborhood completely unrecognizable. It had promised to be a bright, sunny summer day as the family headed to the shelter at 8:30 a.m. Few clouds in the sky, but not enough to compete with the gloriously rising sun. Michael's mind reels from the sight of it all. The sky above is now black and gray from massive plumes of ash riding up across the entire American East Coast. But the clouds are weird. They look like ripples on a lake and are moving quickly across the sky to the west. The upper atmosphere is in absolute turmoil even hours after impact, and in a day, ash from the burning cities in Europe will reach America. Michael has no way of knowing if he'd ever see the sun again, though many scientists had predicted as much. The family home is nothing but ash. The fires were so intense that they'd burned everything but the concrete foundation and rock fireplace. The intensity of the flames had thankfully made them short-lived though, and the area around the shelter is relatively safe. All over the ground lay shards of obsidian, globs of molten lava that had risen high enough into the atmosphere to cool before impacting the ground and bursting like bombs, shredding anyone and anything in the vicinity with razor-sharp obsidian shards. In the distance, where the city skyline used to be visible, all that Michael and Luke can see are the skeletal remains of a few large buildings jutting up into the skyline. It's difficult to see more than that due to how thick the smog-like conditions have become. Coughing and choking, the two quickly decide to head back underground. Michael whispers a silent thank you to his long-dead grandfather for the foresight to install an air filtration system in what was supposed to be a nuclear war fallout shelter. 1 week after impact. There are still batteries for the radio, but Luke hasn't bothered to turn it on for days. There would be no point. Nobody was transmitting anything anymore. For 2 days after impact, they could still pick up transmissions from the West Coast, which had been far less pummeled by the initial impact. However, all of North America is in flames now from the massive wildfires, which run completely unchecked across the continent. The fires have run straight through major cities, and the notoriously dry West Coast went up like a tinderbox. Before the last radio station went down, they had relayed transmission from somewhere in Europe, possibly Germany. Incredibly, somebody had survived the initial impact event, but the news was not good. Hundreds of millions killed in the impact alone, an estimated 1 billion dead across Europe and Africa from tsunamis, the shower of impact debris, and the global wildfires. The air outside the shelter is still not safe to breathe without a respirator. It's choked with ash and toxic vapors given off by burning of trillions of tons of various building materials and other chemical products that make up our cities. The shelter's air filtration system works overtime, and Michael thanks his grandfather daily for having the foresight to install it. Without a doubt though, anyone not inside a shelter with a similar system is dead by now. Michael's thoughts sometimes turn to his neighbor, Carol, but he chases those thoughts away as soon as they appear. There's 6 months worth of food and water in the shelter. It's cramped, uncomfortable, and a bit claustrophobic, but the family has no choice. It's simply not safe to go outside yet, so they wait. 3 months after impact, Michael takes a gulp of air. It's not fresh by any means, but not immediately toxic either. At least it no longer smells of cooked flesh. Whatever toxins still linger in the air, there's nothing he can do about it as the shelter's air filtration system broke down a week ago. Staying in the shelter is no longer feasible, and he calls down to the family. Luke, go ahead and bring your sister and mother up. They won't have to pass the remains of their former neighbor. Michael had personally removed those himself on one of his solo trips up top. This is Lily's first time out of the shelter, and she coughs profusely as she breathes in the slightly toxic atmosphere. Michael frowns, but there's simply nothing he can do for her. He'd like to go and find some masks or respirators, anything. But there doesn't seem to be anything left to scavenge. The fires have claimed everything. Maybe there's something deeper in the city though. Honey, stay here with Lily. Maybe maybe we can make some kind of above-ground shelter? Alexandra nods slowly, then looks around dejectedly. What kind of shelter can she possibly make when there's just nothing left? But she quickly recomposes herself. There's no time for defeatist attitudes. Luke, you and I'll head to the city. Maybe we'll find, something. Luke nods slowly. Michael feels the futility in his son's gaze, but they have to at least try. Surely the fires couldn't have consumed everything. The hike into the city is more difficult than expected. The two have to climb over the molten slag heaps that are all that remains of vehicles caught out in the open after impact. Most of what's left is ash, though, with here and there a surviving support beam sticking out of the remains of homes and small buildings. Visibility has improved, but not by much. Michael can see a few miles ahead to where he knows the downtown area of the city starts. The skeletal remains of the tall buildings that used to rule its skyline are now gone, collapsed in on themselves or knocked over by the massive windstorms that rocked the planet for days after impact. Every mile that passes, Michael keeps hoping that he'll spot something. He's just not sure what, just anything. Some sign that civilization has survived, but each mile brings more disappointment. He knows where the major shopping centers are by memory, but nothing but ashes and ruins remain. The fires have completely gutted even the largest of the big box stores. Humanity has never seen fires on this scale. Only the dinosaurs before them saw the horrors of a planet on fire. After a few more miles, Michael stops, sighing dejectedly. Hold on, son. Let's go back. There's nothing out here. Nothing at all. Luke doesn't reply. He merely nods in agreement. He's too tired to keep going, and much like the rest of the family, doesn't even believe there's a point anymore. That night, the family has their first dinner outside, but they can't even see the moon above their heads due to the cloud cover. Dust and debris has circled the world and will remain aloft for years, maybe as much as a decade. The loss of sunlight has already cooled the world a few degrees, and the wind bites with extra chill despite it being the middle of summer. The world won't descend into an ice age as commonly feared, but it will fully counteract the effects of global warming and drop global temperatures by several degrees for years. The family is quiet as they eat, each lost in their own thoughts. They can't remain where they are, but though none of them will admit it, there really isn't any place to go either. There are no safe zones from an extinction-level event, and though they set out in the morning for the west, heading toward the far mountains and the national park at the foothills, they have no idea that nothing but matchsticks will be waiting for them. The fires have killed over half the vegetation on the entire planet, and what remained has been dying for months, from lack of sunlight and effects of extreme acid rain. The only hope is to find pockets of civilization that haven't been consumed by fire. Maybe they can find more canned goods to survive off. But eventually those will run out or go bad, and there's no knowing if either will happen before sunlight hits the earth again and plants and trees return or not. There's various doomsday seed vaults around the globe and well-planned long-term survival shelters where a tiny population of humans have survived impact. In all likelihood, humanity won't go extinct as predicted. Will it ever be what it once was, though? That's doubtful. What's been lost is incalculable, and even if humanity rebuilds, it'll have scores of lost knowledge to rediscover. Once it tries to move to a second industrial revolution, it'll discover that all the easy gas and oil, which fueled our modern world, has already been greedily sucked up by their ancestors. Is there enough left for a civilization to grow advanced enough to mass-produce renewable energy technologies? Doubtful. For Michael and his family, though, all that matters is tomorrow, and each day looks a little bleaker than the last. A lone wolf sits in the kitchen working on a homemade world-ending bioweapon. Meanwhile, a group of computer scientists in Silicon Valley embrace and cheer over their completion of artificial intelligence they have no idea will destroy the planet. Volcanoes rumble and the flesh-eating gray goo of nanobots falls into the hands of a tyrant in this terrifying tale of how the world might realistically end. Number 8. Asteroid impact. We're gonna start with many people's favorite, and that's all us guys down here getting wiped out because a giant piece of space rock decided it's time to finally meet our planet face to face. Asteroids are not to be taken lightly. You may have heard about a certain impact event that killed off a lot of living things around 66 million years ago. This thing smacked into the water just off Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and formed what we call today the Chicxulub crater. The event might have destroyed 75% of all species on Earth. Yep, that's the one they say ended the dinosaurs. It's theorized that it flew down to Earth traveling in the region of 45,000 miles per hour, and no sooner than you could say, "Did you hear that bang?" Mexico was on fire. This made a crater that was some 62 miles wide. As for the power, the rough estimate is the impact created the force of 21 to 921 billion times that of the atomic bomb that hit Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War. This set off a series of catastrophic events, including a mega tsunami around 330 feet high, smacking into the US coast. The impact would have also set off massive wildfires, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes. Suffice to say, there would have been a lot of dust in the sky, which would have blocked out the sun. That black cloud that covered the Earth might have hung around for a decade, so whatever was living down there, plant or animal, would have had a hard time of it. Add to that a lot of acid rain, and there wouldn't have been much plant life left for animals to eat. If you think 2020 and 2021 were bad years, let's just say those dinosaurs had it much worse than you. That's why we now call it a mass extinction event. So you could be thinking right now, well, that won't happen again. But why not? It's not as if we have any control over what happens in space. There is absolutely no reason why there couldn't be another mass extinction event as a result of the Earth being hit by an asteroid. In fact, given enough time, statistically it will happen. We've been hit by a lot of asteroids over more recent years, although many of them haven't caused much catastrophic damage. Take for instance that one that hit Arizona around 50,000 years ago, which formed the Barringer crater, named after the guy that had the land where it hit, Daniel M. Barringer. It's thought that the rock that made this crater might have only produced enough power to kill plant life and wildlife in the vicinity of the impact area, since it might only have produced a blast force of one nuclear bomb. Still, something like that happening in a place like New York would certainly be a bad day for the city's population. Then you have the Xinjiang event in China in 1490, which records show may have killed around 10,000 people. Only this was likely a meteorite shower, since those records describe falling stones raining from the sky. We haven't had too many impact events to write home about in modern times, although in 1908 there was the Tunguska event in Siberia. It said this produced the power of around 15 megatons of TNT, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Fortunately, not many people lived anywhere near it to be hit, so the explosion just wiped out forest land, and we're talking about 80 million trees. There were quite a few witnesses though. One of them described the event like this. "We started crying out, 'Father, mother, brother,' but no one answered. There was noise beyond the hut. We could hear trees falling down. Karen and I got out of our sleeping bags and wanted to run out, but then the thunder struck. This was the first thunder. The earth began to move and rock. The wind hit our hut and knocked it over. My body was pushed down by sticks, but my head was in the clear. Then I saw a wonder. Trees were falling. The branches were on fire. It became mighty bright. Had that thing hit a major city, and for sure it's only a matter of cosmic luck that it didn't, it could have killed many, many people. According to NASA, to create massive damage, you need an asteroid to hit that was 1 kilometer in diameter or bigger. The one that wrecked that Siberian forest was only around 66 feet wide. But just to let you know, over the many millions of years the Earth has been around, it's been hit by many asteroids that make a 1 kilometer rock look like a pea next to a basketball. The good news is that NASA says there is nothing in space right now of that size that looks like it could impact Earth. The agency added, as best we can tell, no large object is likely to strike the Earth any time in the next several hundred years. Phew! But if you take into account the law of averages and past events, well, you'd have to say that one day the Earth will get a major whack-in again. In fact, some scientists say Earth is hit by such a life-ending piece of rock every 60 million years or so. And that could mean we are due for another bashing. Still, in cosmic terms, say 20,000 or 50,000 years is nothing. Don't go building your bunker just yet. But to finish this off, we think we should inform you that in 2019, an asteroid the size of a football pitch came within 40,000 miles of Earth. That's close in space terms, and NASA admitted that this rock, named 2019 OK, did sneak up on us. If something that size would have hit, it would have the potential to destroy a city and its suburbs. Okay, so that is scary, but it's very, very, very unlikely to happen anytime soon. In terms of your hierarchy of worries, you can shove asteroid impact to the bottom of the pile. There are actually analysts who study the likelihood of the end of the world within the next 100 years, and where a space rock isn't a major concern of theirs, this next one is. Number 7. Natural pandemic. This is probably not what you want to hear, given you've just spent the last 2 years mainlining the pandemic into your conscience thanks to the ever-vigilant, sometimes click-hungry media. Still, never in your wildest dreams did you think the recent virus was going to end the world or anything close to it. But there have been some pretty frightening pandemics before. You probably heard all about the Spanish flu that ravaged some parts of the world between 1918 and 1920. It wasn't Spanish at all. But the reality is this flu killed somewhere in the region of 50 million people. Not world-ending, but it was hardly a scratch either. Then you have the historic plagues, which were certainly no walk in the park for humanity. It's thought that between the years of 1346 to 1353, the aptly named Black Death killed anywhere between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and Africa. It killed between 30 and 60% of the entire European population. So while not the end of the world, the plague was darn efficient at population reduction. That was about as bad as it gets when it comes to killer viruses. But the question is, could anything close to it, or even worse, happen again? If you've been reading the news over the last 2 years, you'll know that many stories have started with the words, "Experts warn." Oh God, not another experts warn story, you probably thought while reading them. In 2019, the Guardian newspaper began a story with this: "Experts warn world grossly unprepared for future pandemics." The story described a scene that sounded like a Hollywood movie. In it, a virulent flu pandemic happens. Within a matter of just 36 hours, people start dropping like flies and no one knows where the virus came from. It causes mayhem, riots ensue, banks close, the power grid goes down, and 28 days later, there are barely enough people left to have a good, meaningful Zoom meeting. The Guardian wrote, minus the Zoom joke, "Such a scenario is entirely plausible and efforts made by governments to prepare for it are grossly insufficient." Many people think it's a possibility. In 2017, the ever-reliable harbinger of doom Bill Gates said as much. Although he said a virus might just wipe out 30 million people. He talked about the big ones, which he said were in the pipeline unless we start to prepare better for such events. In his own words, you might be wondering how real these doomsday scenarios are. The fact that a deadly global pandemic has not occurred in recent history shouldn't be mistaken for evidence that a deadly pandemic will not occur in the future. The experts warn us that we might be hit with a mystery pathogen that we haven't seen before, and that pathogen might look invincible. That's why the World Health Organization talks about Disease X, which is a hypothetic, very deadly, unknown pathogen that strikes us down. This might come from an animal, but it also could be man-made. We'll come back to the pandemic wars later, but first, let's hear about something that humans do as naturally as breathing and might destroy the Earth before we finish this video. Number 6. War. We really can't have a show about the end of the world and leave out war. Back in the day, when Attila the Hun's armies were embracing their violent side, you could kill many people during the campaigns, but battles like that were never going to pose a threat to mankind. Then we modern folks came around and someone got the idea to create bombs that could potentially end the world. The US has around 1,750 deployed nuclear weapons. That's the biggest arsenal, but Russia has around 1,600. And if you paid any attention to Rocky IV, Russia and America aren't exactly the best of buddies. Then you have China, and no one knows how many nuclear weapons that country has. So if you read this recent headline, "Threats from Russia more immediate, but threats from China greater," you might think, well, that's not great. Other countries with such terrible weapons are the UK, France, Pakistan, India, Israel, and everyone's favorite quiet neighbor, North Korea. These countries aren't at war, and you could be accused of scaremongering by talking about war, but we don't know how things will be down the line. There's also the fear that as such weapons become more technologically advanced, they might become hackable. According to a scientist writing for the BBC, even if every single nuclear bomb was fired and hit a target, it would not destroy the Earth or humanity. Still, 14,900 nuclear warheads of varying killing power would make a dent in the human population, perhaps killing up to 1 billion people within the first hour of the blasts. Then you have the radiation sickness, which would finish off many millions more. But that would just be the start, because those bloodthirsty generals would want more blood. The war would continue. And what if every weapon at a country's disposal was used? All-out war could be almost world-ending. Using a theoretical scenario, some scientists have said that the detonation of all nuclear weapons could create such a mess that people would not be able to survive in the aftermath. Slowly, they'd get hungry and sick and die. There would be raging fires in cities, and the soot in the sky blocking out the sun could kick off a nuclear winter. One scientist named Alan Robock, who took the temperature drop of a nuclear winter seriously, said this could end life on Earth. What if we built bigger bombs, those known as doomsday devices? The ones we dropped in the past were pretty weak compared to modern ones. As one disarmament activist put it, in the current U.S. nuclear arsenal, for example, the W-88 warheads deployed on Trident II submarine-launched missiles have an estimated yield of 475 kilotons, compared to the estimated yield of 12 to 13 kilotons of Little Boy dropped on Hiroshima. In 1979, the Office of Technology Assessment in the U.S. tried to estimate the damage that would happen if just the U.S. and the Soviet Union fired all their weapons at each other, with the prediction being that 35 to 77% of all people in the U.S. would perish and 20 to 40% of the people in the Soviet Union would die. That was with the older bombs. So, in the words of the band REM, this war would be the end of the world as we know it. But we reckon there would be some folks that get through it by living in their 6-star bunkers for a decade or two. As much as this certainly is a real threat, we still don't think any world leader would want to initiate global destruction. Let's just hope those weapons never become hackable. Now we need to talk about artificial intelligence. A world ender if ever we've seen one. Number 5. AI. Many of you will have heard the name Nick Bostrom. He's an expert on artificial intelligence, and he's been outspoken for a long time regarding the existential threat it poses. Like Elon Musk, he believes that a kind of superintelligent AI could wreck the world in a similar fashion to how it was done in the Terminator franchise. On his own website, he talks a bit about the various world-ending scenarios, including a far-out one in which everything in a world is just a simulation, a la The Matrix, and for some reason, whoever programs that simulation decides they're done with it and shuts it down. As for AI, he says we might program it badly, that it leads to utter destruction. In his own words, he says, "When we create the first superintelligent entity, we might make a mistake and give it goals that lead to annihilating humankind, assuming its enormous intellectual advantage gives it the power to do so." As an example, he asks, what if we gave this intelligence a mathematical problem, but that problem was so hard it had to turn all the matter in the solar system into a giant calculating device and by doing so, kill us all? Other people have said, what if we told this AI to create a program to ensure the future safety of our planet, but then the AI decides that the only way to do that is get rid of us humans? Musk has similar worries, saying that we might one day create what he called an AI immortal dictator. He said at least when there's an evil dictator, that human is going to die, but for AI there would be no death, it would live forever, and then you'd have an immortal dictator from which we can never escape. This intelligence might just decide that we humans are not needed down here. Why it does that, we don't know, but if it does, we won't have a chance. Musk explained it like this: it's just like if we're building a road and an anthill just happens to be in the way. We don't hate ants, we're just building a road, and so goodbye anthill. The main concern about AI centers around what some people call an intelligence explosion, meaning we create some AI that is able to improve itself, and so becomes way more powerful than we expected it to in a short time. In Bostrom's words, when it comes to AI, we're like kids playing around with a bomb. He said, we have little idea when the detonation will occur, though if we hold the device to our ear, we can hear a faint ticking sound. He, Musk, and Bill Gates all believe that even though right now the AI we create couldn't cause much damage, the explosion is possible. Once that happens, what the AI might want could be very different from what humans want. Bostrom explained that the AI's goals might be incompatible with human survival, not because the AI is evil, it's a computer, it doesn't have feelings. He gives this amusing but scary example. Consider a superintelligent agent that wanted to maximize the number of paperclips in existence, and that was powerful enough to get its way. It might then want to eliminate humans to prevent us from switching it off, since that would reduce the number of paperclips that are built. It might also want to use atoms in our bodies to build more paperclips. It may seem silly to talk about a world ending over some paperclips, but in reality, any number of goals could lead to the destruction because the AI just wants to do its job as best it can. This is why we have to be so careful about programming it. Quite a lot of scientists scoff at such a doomsday scenario, and they say we have many other bigger issues to contend with. But some of those issues might be, say, getting rid of viruses or solving some of the world's environmental problems. This is the very reason why we are in the process of trying to develop computer programs that can do that, and we're getting better and better at it. Bostrom believes that we will succeed in developing superintelligent computers sometime around the middle of this century, and if that becomes the reality, we might solve those aforementioned problems, but the Pandora's box we've opened might just end us too. Maybe now you're thinking, okay, simple, just turn the damn thing off when it gets too big for its boots. Bostrom had this to say about that scenario. A free-roaming, super-intelligent agent would presumably be able to anticipate that humans might attempt to switch it off, and if it didn't want that to happen, take precautions to guard against that eventuality. Lastly, the great physicist Stephen Hawking stood behind what Bostrom is saying. Hawking agreed that soon AI could very well help us to end disease and poverty, but he also said the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. Hawking added, "We cannot quite know what will happen if a machine exceeds our own intelligence, so we can't know if we'll be infinitely helped by it or ignored by it and sidelined or conceivably destroyed by it." Okay, now for something a bit more down-to-earth but equally frightening. Number 4. Supervolcano. In 2019, an article in the New York Times read, "A giant volcano could end human life on Earth as we know it." Life is really starting to feel tenuous right now. The article talks about the Yellowstone supervolcano, which gets an 8 out of 8 points in the Volcanic Explosivity Index. Still, the good news is it's only erupted 3 times in the last 2.1 million years, with the last one being some 640,000 years ago. If it went off tomorrow, the earthquakes would mean massive eruptions of magma and everything for miles around being buried in lava. That would really suck for people nearby, but for folks in the region it would mean their world turning dark because of volcanic ash. Those ash clouds would keep moving all over the US, and the result of that would be massive contamination of soil and the possibility of the power grid going down. Outside the US, there would also be mayhem. The article in the Times explained, over the short term, as the toxic cloud blocked sunlight, the global average temperatures could plunge significantly and not return to normal for several years. Rainfall would decline sharply. That might be enough to trigger a die-off of tropical rainforests. Farming could collapse. The newspaper cited a report written by some European scientists who said the Yellowstone supervolcano going off would become the greatest catastrophe since the dawn of civilization. Still, many scientists would say whoever wrote that article was guilty of hyperbole. They'd say that even though it would be a terrible disaster, not even all Americans would die. There are also bigger supervolcanoes in the world, such as Mount Rainier in the US. For sure, a volcanic eruption with its ash clouds could cause many humans to suffer over a long period of time, but one eruption wouldn't end the human race. As an example, there's the theory that the Companion Ignimbrite eruption 39,000 years ago could have helped wipe out the Neanderthals, but life went on in the long run. 75,000 years ago was when the Toba eruption happened in Indonesia. The theory is that this was the biggest eruption in many millions of years. Scientists say it could have caused a volcanic winter that lasted 6 to 10 years. That's when the Earth cooled from all the ash and other debris hiding the sun. After that eruption, the Earth's temperature might have been affected for as long as 1,000 years. It's now thought that it significantly decreased the human population and created what's called an evolution genetic bottleneck. It's all theoretical, but there's little doubt that the destruction caused was profound. Again, people survived and life went on, but what if that happened again in modern times? We should also point out that not all experts believe that this eruption almost finished off humans before they really got started. One of them told the BBC, over the last 10 years or so, people have become more skeptical that Toba almost killed off Homo sapiens. Like Yellowstone, Toba is still active today, and while it's very unlikely one single supervolcano eruption could finish us, if by some chance 2 or 3 happened all within a few years of each other, well, that could be slightly doomful. As the saying goes, there's a first time for everything. Now, we'll talk about regular evil again. Number 3. Human-developed biological weapon. In his list of possible world-ending scenarios, cheery Nick Bostrom added genetically engineered biological agents. Many other experts also see this as a threat. As if naturally occurring pathogens weren't already scary enough, what if someone let loose a man-made virus? This is sometimes called the lone wolf scenario, something that Hollywood has been making tons of money out of for years. Bostrom explained, with the fabulous advances in genetic technology currently taking place, it may become possible for a tyrant, terrorist, or lunatic to create a doomsday virus, an organism that combines long latency with high virulence and mortality. He also said there's a possibility that we could create a world-ending virus by accident, giving the example of some Australian researchers who, when trying to come up with a contraceptive virus for mice to better deal with them as pests, they made a modified mousepox virus. It had a mortality rate of 100%, meaning that all mice that got it died. Thankfully, that virus was not transmissible to humans, but imagine If one day scientists were doing something to save the smallpox virus, and by accident, they created a monster of a virus, then imagine it escaped the lab, as smallpox has done in the past. Humans will always research viruses because we want to better understand them and ensure that we can control outbreaks in the future. That's why some people call biotechnology both a blessing and a curse. There are accidents, and there are also tyrants that might want to create a bioweapon. This is what the Future for Life Institute wrote about. Developed nations and even impoverished ones have the resources and know-how to produce bioweapons. For example, North Korea is rumored to have assembled an arsenal containing anthrax, botulism, hemorrhagic fever, plague, smallpox, typhoid, and yellow fever ready in case of attack. It says the cost of developing such weapons has reduced a lot in the last decade or so, and it's now conceivable that the technology could fall into the wrong hands. It's become easier to manufacture strands of DNA, with the same institute saying it could become possible for someone to print deadly proteins or cells at home. In an article published in the Stanford University website, a headline read, "Biological Warfare, an Emerging Threat in the 21st Century." In it, Stephen Block, a professor of biological sciences and applied physics, said he is certainly scared of the wrong kind of people getting their hands on something as terrifying as the smallpox virus and then letting it loose on the population. Block said, "We're tempted to say nobody in their right mind would ever use these things, but not everybody is in their right mind." He talked about his greatest fear, which is these people developing their own kinds of superviruses. This is sometimes called black technology and means the use of genetic engineering to make viruses more virulent. If such bad people can get their hands on the genetic maps of pathogens, Block says they might be able to create an extremely virulent strain of a virus. With genetic editing tools, perhaps they can make something that renders our vaccines useless. This could end the world. It's a long shot, but it is certainly a cause for concern. If someone could create a super transmissible version of something like smallpox or Ebola or Marburg and somehow release it into populations, the outcome would be awful. In fact, the virus with the highest fatality rate is the rabies virus. The WHO says once clinical symptoms appear, rabies is virtually 100% fatal. Thankfully, it's not as if anyone could control the minds of rabid dogs and create a global rabid dog army, but a regular virus could be bad enough if manipulated with new tools. Humans have invented something called CRISPR-Cas9 technology, which enables geneticists to edit parts of the genome. In the wrong hands, could a flu virus be created that mankind could not overcome? The answer is it is not totally implausible. We still don't know if the pandemic of late was the result of a lab leak, but if it turns out it was, just look at the destruction it caused. Now, imagine if something worse was created. Testifying in front of Congress not long ago, Alan Schaefer, the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, said this: "Science is revealing the means to weaponize biology and chemistry in ways that were purely theoretical only 10 years ago. As we continue to move forward, it's becoming increasingly apparent that creativity is our limit, not science. The technology is there, and again, we are playing with fire." We'll come back to nightmarish technology soon, but first, we want to show you that a combo of natural causes could finish us off. Number 2. The killer combo. The Permian-Triassic extinction event is said to be the worst extinction event that has ever happened on planet Earth. It wiped out 95% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species, as well as a good chunk of the insects. That's why it's sometimes called the Great Dying, and it happened all by itself. It occurred around 250 million years ago, and it might have lasted as long as 10 million years or as little as 10,000 years. No one really knows. And there are lots of theories as to what went down. Still, some scientists warned that the combination of things that happened back then could happen again. In short, what did happen is incredibly large volcanic eruptions in Siberia caused the oceans to heat up and greenhouse gases to fill the air. When the dust cloud settled, it left a lot of carbon dioxide in the air, and things just kept getting warmer, while the water and the soil became more toxic. Meanwhile, massive emissions of hydrogen sulfide and methane further added to the killing off of plants and animals. It was a bad time for everyone and everything. Recently, some scientists at the University of Washington said to create similar conditions, we might not need any volcanic event, although one could certainly help things along. Scientists have said that our current global warming crisis could in the end have a similar impact, and we might be heading for what they call a sixth great extinction. One of them said, "It does terrify me to think that we're on a trajectory similar to the Permian because we don't really want to be on that trajectory." The same people tell us that levels of carbon dioxide here on Earth are rising so dramatically that we can compare the present to this past event. We are seeing the world heat up faster than it has in 65 million years, and the oceans acidifying 100 times faster than they have in about 20 million years. What these scientists are saying is this could trigger a number of events, just like in the past. And while killing off animals and plants will take a long time, slowly but surely we could all die. It will be a ponderous and painful death, with lots of famine, lots of strange weather patterns, and you could certainly throw in some war over resources when things get bad. One scientist believes that we humans can stop another great dying from happening by cutting back on our carbon emissions, saying, you know what they say, learn from history, because if you don't, you will repeat it. Then again, nature might have its own plan, and even if we can sort things out, the extinction might be down to natural causes. Alright, now for the greatest threat to not just humanity but the planet itself. Number 1. Nanotechnology. After some in-depth research, the Future Humanity Institute came to the conclusion that human extinction was 19% possible by the year 2100. Ahead of war and AI and viruses, there was something called molecular nanotechnology weapons, which you must admit sounds pretty fascinating. First of all, some of you might not even know what nanotechnology is. Basically, it means the understanding and construction of things at the molecular level. Nano comes from a Greek word meaning dwarf, so nanotechnology means the tech of very, very small. Just to make this clear, when we talk about nanotechnology, we're referring to something smaller than 100 nanometers. In just 1 inch, there are 25,400,000 nanometers. This technology is the next big thing. It's next generation. A tech that will improve medicine, aerospace, energy, transportation, how we construct buildings, electronic devices, and cars and planes. It will make the products you use stronger and last longer. As one expert put it, nanotechnology will replace our entire manufacturing base with a new, radically more precise, radically less expensive, and radically more flexible way of making products. It is the future, but it also has the potential to do bad things. Scientists tell us that when we can manipulate the molecular machinery of life, we are at risk of creating a catastrophe. Researchers working with nanotechnology have warned us that the technology, while brilliant at creating benign applications, might also be used to make weapons of mass destruction that the world has never seen. Like with artificial intelligence, when we see breakthroughs in nanotechnology, we are well aware that we are playing with fire. By using molecular manufacturing methods, we will almost undoubtedly create nanotech weaponry that could lead to an arms race similar to what we saw with the atomic bomb. As pessimistic as that sounds, you have to remember that we humans never ignore a good technology's potential to do great harm. Even if we don't want to do harm, we will create the weapons just because we think other countries will do just that. Basically, the creation of these new weapons is inevitable, and that's why so many people are now saying they are a major risk in terms of the end of the world. While you haven't been paying attention, governments of the world have been thinking about such weapons. You've likely never heard of the theoretical mini-nuke, a bomb that could weigh just a few pounds and could have the destructive capacity of any large-scale nuclear weapon we've seen so far. A handheld nuke would be bad news. Enough of these things could potentially annihilate us all, and while we haven't made such weapons yet, do you think if we have the know-how, our great governments will leave them alone? According to US media, China, Russia, and the US are already investing billions of dollars into such weapons. When a US physicist and futurist was interviewed by CNBC about this technology, he offered this stark reply: "Nanobots are the real concern about wiping out humanity because they can be weapons of mass destruction." If it's not bad enough that governments want to exploit this tech for the common bad, there's also the risk that terrorists and tyrants might get hold of the nanotechnology. That physicist also pointed out that such weapons could act like insects. So on your way to work, you feel this prick on your arm, and the next thing you know, you're frothing at the mouth. Such tech could certainly come in handy if you want to take out a president. If it all sounds a bit too Black Mirror for you, the US Army Research Laboratory has already created tiny drones that look like insects. Just imagine what you could do with one of those if it was carrying poison. Imagine if thousands of them were released on a community and to the onlooker's eye they just looked like mosquitoes. That's no joke at all. A physicist called them the most horrific near-term nanoweapons, while researchers at Cambridge University announced at a conference way back in 2008 that these things pose one of the biggest threats in human history regarding the complete destruction of every man, woman, and child. Those researchers said there was a 5% chance that even a nanotechnology accident could kill 1 million people by that date. They also said there was a 10% chance that 1 billion people could die from nanotech weapons. So, in short, if the point isn't clear enough to you already, Those who understand are mighty concerned about what humans might create using this molecular engineering. We just mentioned accidents. Now we'll expand on that. Let's imagine we've created some tiny insects that do great things, such as fly en masse to try and fix a sinking ship. Maybe we get so far in the development that these things are so small and so skilled they can also go inside your body and stop internal bleeding or even prevent cancer cells from replicating. This is the future, and it could be an amazing place. But the dream of nanobots making the world a better place has a corresponding nightmare. That is, we lose control of them. One person writing about this provided an example scenario. There's a massive oil spill, so we send in the nanobots to go and break down all those harmful hydrocarbons. But those nanobots are highly advanced, so they can self-replicate, and like an unending swarm, they not only eat the hydrocarbons, but they feast on pretty much anything in our natural world. That's it. Game over. This is called the gray goo scenario, with the swarm of nanobots being the goo. They devour everything in their path, and humans are unable to stop them since they replicate so fast. If you could somehow program them to do the devouring, you could use the technology as a weapon of mass destruction. This dystopian tale is so far one of science fiction, and these days scientists will tell you that such a thing shouldn't ever happen. But they will also tell you that when we start messing with the nanoparticles, we are walking into an extremely high-risk area. That's why governments are already thinking about the ethics of nanotechnology and why rampant nanomachines are taken seriously. But even if you don't buy into swarms of tiny machines getting up your nose and eating your insides, you should give some thought to the very down-to-earth concern of governments using these machines to spy on you. They'd also be pretty good at breaking up crowds of protesters. The following is a fictionalized scenario, though many scientists agree that it's not only possible but inevitable, and most expected to happen very soon. It's a quiet Valentine's Day morning in 2021. For a month and a half, the world's been grateful that the dreadfulness of 2020 is finally over. But it seems disaster has one last gasp. 100 miles off the North American northwest coast, two continental plates are stuck in a million-year-old shoving match. The Juan de Fuca Oceanic Plate and the North American Continental Plate have been drifting in opposite directions for much longer than humanity's been around, with the Juan de Fuca Plate being forced under the massive North American Plate. The process hasn't been smooth though, and the two plates have been stuck in place for a very long time. The massive force is acting on the Cascadia subduction zone, creating a noticeable bulge in the crust of the Earth. At 8:03 a.m., 80 miles of the Juan de Fuca Plate finally buckle from the incredible strain, slipping under the North American Plate. In an instant, the bulge flattens, and an energy equivalent to the total output of the entire planet in 1 year is released. Mere milliseconds after the collapse, the entire Pacific Northwest coast from British Columbia to Northern California begins to shake. The foreshock alone measures a whopping magnitude 6, rattling commuters just now driving to work all across the Pacific coast of North America. Even as far south as Los Angeles, homes are rattled, pictures falling off the walls, but the nightmare has only just begun. The shaking very quickly intensifies dramatically, and suddenly buildings and bridges are swaying several feet in the air, pushing their earthquake tolerances to the absolute limit. Smart government regulation has mandated for decades that American and Canadian high-rise buildings and bridges both are built to withstand large quakes, and despite their appearance, even the largest skyscrapers are surprisingly resistant. But no skyscraper and no city on Earth has ever faced the wrath of a magnitude 10 earthquake. The shaking is so severe that the tops of the skyscrapers are now swaying over 3 feet in the opposite direction of their bases, causing a 6-foot offset. This is too much for many of even the most modern and earthquake-proof buildings, and internal support columns begin to crack under the incredible strain. Inside of the high-rise offices and apartment buildings, people are thrown across rooms, then violently tossed back in the opposite direction from the awesome force of the mighty shaking. Water pipes feeding fire suppression systems burst, flooding the inside of the buildings. After the first 30 seconds, some of the interior walls begin to crumble, exposing dangerous live wires to the water streaming out of burst pipes. Thousands are electrocuted. Incredible as it seems, there are still 4.5 minutes left of shaking to go. Plate glass windows built to resist hurricane-force winds and tremendous impacts shatter from the strain of twisting and swaying in their frames as the building dances back and forth around them. People are hurled out of now open windows to the streets below. Those running for their lives on city streets are showered with guillotine blaze-sized chunks of glass and falling people alike. On bridges across the American Northwest, cars are violently thrown to and fro. Panicking drivers either try to speed off the wildly swaying bridges or slam their brakes in terror. This causes a massive traffic jam, trapping motorists on the dangerously swaying bridges. Many flee their vehicles on foot, crawling over stuck vehicles and doing their best not to be thrown off the bridge by violent swaying. But after 45 seconds of violent shaking, it's finally too much. The structural tolerances of bridges all across Cascadia are exceeded, and one by one bridges collapse, plunging thousands to their deaths. Rail lines are severed all across the region, causing trains to derail and plow into surrounding buildings. Passengers and cargo are spilled all over cities and the wilderness, causing many more deaths, along with a massive environmental disaster as millions of tons of industrial chemicals and wastes are spilled across some of the most pristine forests in North America. Massive fires erupt as oil and gas being shipped by rail freight is spilled in train disaster after disaster. Now, the Pacific Northwest is not only shaking, it's burning. Back in the cities, people flee the violently swaying buildings, but they find no safety on the streets. Falling glass and masonry slices and crushes people running for their lives, and as gas mains are severed, massive explosions rock cities in the affected area. Raw sewage floods city streets. Sinkholes begin to emerge and swallow people by the dozens. At a minute and a half of shaking, all but the sturdiest skyscrapers begin to crumble. There are still 3.5 minutes left. Powerful waves of energy deep beneath the earth combine with the normal shaking caused by the massive earthquake to create a unique scenario in the ground above it. The soil itself seems to liquefy, shaken so violently that it becomes almost like quicksand. While most skyscrapers have survived up to this point, this is the final nail in the coffin. Buildings weighing millions of tons suddenly sink several feet into the ground, losing their firm foundations and now shaking uncontrollably. The center support columns vital to keeping skyscrapers aloft snap like toothpicks, and almost as if caught in a controlled demolition, skyscraper after skyscraper seems to collapse inward. Masonry the size of boulders rains down across city blocks, burying anybody caught in the open. Those stuck inside the collapsing buildings have almost no chance of survival, though a few of those who took shelter in basements and parking garages become entombed by the falling debris. Incredibly, the earth continues to shake at such violent magnitude for another 3 minutes. The full 5 minutes of constant shaking is enough to bring down nearly every structure over 4 stories all across the North American wilderness. The cities of Seattle, Vancouver, Portland, Spokane, Tacoma, and Boise, along with a few others, are almost all completely leveled. Its devastation on a scale humanity has not seen since the end of the Second World War. Entire cities once full of over 500,000 people have nearly disappeared in a haze of dust and smoke. Iconic landmarks such as Seattle's Space Needle are gone, brought low by the worst earthquake humanity has ever endured. Massive fires have broken out, and from space it appears as if almost the entire region of Cascadia is in flames. However, fire will very soon be the least of the survivors' concerns. Less than a minute after the shaking finally stops, it finally arrives. The most devastating tsunami in recorded history. The incoming tsunami is so massive that entire ports all along the coast are emptied of water just before its arrival. Many recognize this portent of impending doom from videos of the infamous tsunamis in Southeast Asia and Japan and begin to flee for their lives. Others stare dumbfounded as marine life flops and gasps for breath, where just moments ago they were swimming in water up to 30 feet deep. The fish don't have to wait long for the water to return. Racing at 1,000 miles per hour, the tsunami towers 200 feet in the air, or almost 80 feet higher than the 2011 Japanese tsunami that devastated the country. Survivors of the violent shaking scramble to get to rooftops all across the North American coast, but there are few buildings tall enough to save them. The incoming wave measures nearly 14 stories tall, and as it finally breaks on land, it washes right over the coastal infrastructure, crushing thousands under the pounding waves. The real devastation, however, comes not from the height of the tsunami wave, but the incredible power behind it. Entire buildings are ripped from their foundations and carried along with the wave as the waters push an incredible half-mile inland in most places. Anything still standing in coastal cities is now under assault by a battering ram of trillions of tons of water and debris, and for most surviving buildings, it's too much. Skyscrapers that miraculously survived the shaking are brought low by the battering ram effect of the crushing waves. The wave takes almost half a day to begin to wash back out to sea, by which time a tsunami wave sent toward Asia finally makes landfall in Japan and China's coast. Hawaii has long since been inundated, though thanks to the warning, actual fatalities are almost zero. Devastation reminiscent of the 2011 Japanese tsunami wreaks havoc as far south as Vietnam. Back in North America, rescue efforts by the U.S. military begin almost immediately after the start of the disaster, but there are few to save. By the time the waters finally recede, any survivors of the earthquake who had been taking refuge in basements or car garages have been drowned. Others further inland and ahead of the waves may have as little as days left to live before the breathable air runs out. With thousands of collapsed buildings to search in each affected city and dozens of major population centers affected, there's simply not enough rescue personnel in the US and Canada to save most of those trapped. Sea levels return to their normal state after a day, but the fires take 2 weeks to put out. So much smoke has been created by the burning cities that smog spreads as far east as Detroit. When the smoke finally clears, the North American Pacific Northwest looks like a world war has been waged there. Cities have been turned to rubble and ash, but the pristine forests and pride of Cascadia have burned out of control for half a month. Untold millions of acres have been reduced to glowing embers, the damage shockingly visible from space and appearing like a massive gray scar on the North American continent. The final death toll is in the millions and will only climb as disease and starvation begins to take its toll on an entire region whose infrastructure has been completely devastated. To make matters worse, a resurgent winter begins its icy chill down on the area, and many survivors freeze to death for a lack of proper heating. The U.S. military pours its massive resources into humanitarian efforts in cities on both the American and Canadian side of the border, bolstered by a huge global response to this unprecedented disaster. Even countries normally at odds with the U.S. send aid. Chinese and Russian search and rescue personnel working alongside U.S. and Canadian personnel. Much like in the Christmas tsunami of Southeast Asia and the Japanese 2011 tsunami, the world has been united by tragedy, but the affected area is simply too large, and there are too many victims and not enough aid. The earthquake's death toll will continue well into summer as starvation and disease plagues those who lived through the most destructive earthquake in world history. Our planet is a living planet and the only known celestial body to have both a fully functioning climate system and active plate tectonics. But all that moving and shaking makes the Earth a potentially dangerous place to call home. And natural disasters are an unfortunate but inevitable part of life for any species that calls our blue marble home. Evolving around 100,000 years ago, modern man has barely been around for but a blink of an eye in the Earth's history. And while we've been spared some of the greatest catastrophes to ever rock the planet, we've faced our share of natural disasters. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Infographic Show. Today we're taking a look at the worst natural disasters in human history. 10. With humans first settling large river valleys, floods have been one of our persistent woes throughout human history. Yet few floods have ever matched the devastation of the Central China flood, occurring across the span of Middle China in 1931, preceded by an abnormally heavy monsoon season that resulted in 9 cyclones in 1 month just prior to the flood. China was alternatively rocked by heavy drought and then extreme rainfall. This sudden rainfall led to the Yangtze, Yellow, and Huai rivers bursting their banks and flooding central China, killing millions of people and causing enormous property damage. Famous as the deadliest flood of the 20th century, the Central China flood killed an estimated 3.7 to 4 million people. 9. Egypt-Syria earthquake of 1202. The deadliest earthquake in recorded history. 13th century Egypt and Syria were rocked by a megaquake that led to a cascading cycle of disasters, such as floods, tsunamis, and then famine from devastated crops. Thought to have been caused by a geologic shift under the Dead Sea, the earthquake created a tsunami which led to extreme flooding. All in all, the string of disasters left over 1.1 million people dead in the region. 8. North Korea's arduous march. North Korea has a long history of rebranding its natural disasters, and few in its history were more devastating than the arduous march that began in 1994 and lasted for 4 years, nearly half a decade in length. The arduous march started as a famine, which was quickly exacerbated by a series of natural disasters. With its roots in ineffective government and the collapse of North Korea's patron state, the Soviet Union, natural disasters intensified the effects of the resulting famines, leading to over 500,000 deaths. Recently, North Korea has warned its citizens that another arduous march is incoming, and the world may soon see a repeat of one of the worst disasters in modern history. 7. Great Bengal Famine of 1770. Often at the whim of a precocious Mother Nature, humanity is no stranger to famines. Ruled by the British East India Company at the time, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770 struck territories in modern West Bengal, Bangladesh, Assam, Odisha, Bihar, and Jharkhand. A shortfall of crops in 1768 was a precursor to the disaster, but it was at the time nothing out of the ordinary. However, after the failure of the annual southeast monsoon, a severe drought gripped the area and crops failed across the region. Initial reports of starvation were largely ignored by the East India Company until mass starvation struck in 1770. A series of disease outbreaks and mismanagement by the British ultimately resulted in over 10 million deaths among the native population. 6. Chinese Drought of 1876. Drought inevitably leads to famine, and no drought was deadlier than that which gripped China in 1876. A 3-year drought brought on by failure of regional monsoons devastated crops across the nation, leading to between 9 to 13 million deaths from starvation. Perhaps feeling guilty over their historical inaction in the face of catastrophe, the British actually organized a global relief effort organized by British missionary Timothy Richter, who established the Shandong Famine Relief Committee. Richard kept a detailed diary of the catastrophe and highlighted people eating the material of their own houses, selling wives and daughters in a bid to stay alive, and even dead children being boiled and eaten. 5. The 1918 flu pandemic. Disease is one of humanity's oldest foes, and few are more persistent than the seasonal flu. Yet taking hold amidst the destruction brought on by World War I, the 1918 flu pandemic would be the deadliest in history, infecting 500 million people and killing between 20 and 50 million of them. Yet the strain of flu responsible was no more virulent or deadly than the modern flu, and instead became deadly by ravaging a world population suffering from poor hygiene, concentrations of war casualty hospitals, and poor nutrition, all side effects of the First World War. First observed in Europe, it's unknown where exactly the flu started, but it quickly made its way around the world. In America alone, it dropped the life expectancy by a whopping 12 years. 4. Yellow River Flood. China is home to some of the world's mightiest rivers, and as a result is prone to the most catastrophic floods in history. Due to the elevated nature of the Yellow River, which runs along natural dikes that raise it above the plains that surround it, it is one of the most flood-prone rivers on Earth, a fact well known by the local Chinese, who for millennia reinforced the banks of the rivers with artificial dikes. Yet in 1887, after days of extremely heavy flooding, the Yellow River burst its banks, flooding large portions of eastern China and covering an estimated 50,000 square miles. The initial floods left 2 million people homeless, and the resulting famine and lack of essentials led to the death of an estimated 900,000 people. 3. 1556 Shaanxi Earthquake. Drought, famine, and floods. It seems China really has it all when it comes to the worst of the worst. One of the deadliest earthquakes on record, the 1556 Shaanxi earthquake, struck on the morning of January 23rd during the Ming Dynasty. An area of 520 miles wide was completely flattened by the tremors, and an estimated 830,000 people died, with 60% of the region's population dying and absolute destruction in urban areas. The total cost of the earthquake is all but impossible to calculate. 2. 1970 Bola Cyclone. It seems Asia is a rather unkind place to live, but thankfully we can leave China alone for the moment. Striking East Pakistan in India's West Bengal on November 12, 1970, the 1970 Bola Cyclone is one of the worst storms the region has ever seen, and the deadliest storm in recorded history. Due to a severely inadequate early warning system in Pakistan, the total death toll is estimated to be as high as 500,000. Sadly, just after a duo of destructive cyclones in 1960, the Pakistan government had contacted the Americans for assistance in developing a national early warning system to help people evacuate. After a detailed study and subsequent report granted to Pakistani authorities by the director of America's National Hurricane Center, it was revealed that the Pakistani government did not carry out most of the recommendations given to them, leading to 1970's staggering death toll. 1. 576 Earthquake of Antioch. Striking ancient Syria. The earthquake of 576 AD in Antioch devastated the Byzantine Empire and all but completely leveled the city. The earthquake struck without warning on a morning between May 20th through the 29th and killed an estimated 250,000 people. Based on the severity of the destruction, scientists estimate that the earthquake was between a category 8 and 9 on the Mercalli intensity scale. The survivors of the initial earthquake then faced a massive fire which consumed all of the remaining standing buildings, nearly wiping out the city in its entirety. Emperor Justin I was reportedly so devastated by the news of the death toll that he entered the church in Constantinople without any of his holy symbols in an act of humility before God. A massive relief and rebuilding effort would see the city restored, but its inhabitants would forever be haunted by the death of 250,000 people. For as long as we remain on the earth, humanity will continue to see its fair share of natural disasters. Yet modern improvements in warning and alerting systems and international cooperation between nations to coordinate relief efforts has seen death tolls dramatically lower. Despite this, though, it's certain that humanity still lives on a dangerous world. And with bubbling supervolcanoes slumbering under Italy and Yellowstone in North America, the real worst natural disaster in history may not lie in our past, but in our immediate future, perhaps even as early as tomorrow. It was July 9, 1958, and an earthquake on the Fairweather Fault in the Alaska Panhandle rattled for about 1 minute. It was the strongest in Alaska for 60 years, and it could be felt as far away as Seattle. The quake sent around 82 million tons of rock into the waters of Lituya Bay. All that rock hitting the water was like an asteroid impact, and the result was the world's tallest mega tsunami, measuring something like 1,720 feet. The giant mass of a wave continued down the bay, taking with it any vegetation on the mountainside. That monster destroyed everything in its path. One man and his son were sleeping in a boat in that bay as all this happened. Through the skin of their teeth, they survived, but others weren't so lucky. Howard Ulrich and his 8-year-old son named Sonny had been catching some Z's on their boat, the Edgery, when the earthquake happened. They'd been out salmon fishing throughout the day and had retired to their bunks. Just after 10 p.m., their bunks started shaking, almost knocking the two guys to the floor. Howard had no idea what had happened, so he got up and went to the deck. The boat was still shaking violently from side to side. Suddenly, there was an eerie calm for about 2.5 minutes, and what followed almost knocked Howard off his feet. He heard a crashing sound that was deafening, which was the rocks hitting the water in the bay. His son joined him on the deck. They both looked into the distance down the bay, and on each side they saw the mountains shuddering, sending snow flying high into the air. Suddenly, the two witnessed a wave coming toward them so large they could hardly believe their eyes. As the wave approached, though, it became smaller. Still, it was racing down the bay at about 120 miles per hour, taking out trees on the mountainside, plucking hundreds from their roots in a matter of seconds. Howard now knew that this was no time for standing around and admiring the power of nature. There was no way this wave was going to stop before it hit their small boat. Howard told Sonny to put on his life preserver and start praying to God Almighty. There was not much he could do to steer the boat out of the way since it was anchored, but he managed to turn on the engine and steer the boat so it was facing the oncoming wave. Had he not done that, the two might not have survived. Howard dropped the anchor as low as it could go, and his last words on the anchor were, "Mayday, Mayday, this is Edgery in the Lituya Bay. All hell has busted loose in here. I think we've had it. Goodbye." The wave was now 1,720 feet when it was close enough for Howard to really see what was coming, but receded to just 100 feet high as it neared. When it finally reached them, the wave was only around 50 to 75 feet high, but that was enough to snap that anchor chain like it was nothing but a fishing line. The boat rose high into the air, riding the wave. With such force, Howard believed that the boat would be thrown to the land and smashed to pieces, but that didn't happen. Once they were over the crest of the wave, there was more danger, because the choppy waters were full of debris that the wave had taken with it. The two weren't out of trouble yet, and little did they know others were in danger too. Unfortunately, not everyone was as lucky as Howard and Sonny and managed to ride the mega tsunami. Some would succumb to the giant wave. There were two other boats in the bay on that historic day, a boat owned by Bill and V. Swanson named the Badger, and a boat named Sunmore owned by another couple, Orville and Mickey Wagner. Both those couples were actually friends and prior to the incident had waved across the water and said hello. When Bill Swanson felt the swaying of the boat, he too got up to see what was happening. He later described what he saw next was like a big load of rocks spilling out of a dump truck. That might have been an understatement, because the rocks that hit the water would have weighed as much as 240 Empire State Buildings. The Swanson's boat was lifted even higher when it was hit by the wave, In Bill's own words, he said, "We went away up over the trees and I looked down on the rocks as big as an ordinary house as we crossed the spit. We were away above them. It felt like we were in a tin can and somebody was shaking it." Looking down at the trees, Bill believed that he was at least 80 feet in the air when on the crest of the wave. That crest broke and the Badger landed quite close to the shoreline. The boat soon began to sink and suddenly trees and other debris flooded it. Bill was hit in the chest and broke a couple of ribs, but both he and his wife didn't go under. The couple, still in their underwear, quickly got in their small dinghy. The water was rough and full of trees, but they managed to use that dinghy to steer out of danger. They were rescued by a fishing boat about 2 hours later. Referring to what he saw that evening right after the earthquake, Bill later said, "People shake their head when I tell them I saw it that night. I can't help it if they don't believe me, but I know what I saw that night." On the opposite side of the bay, the Sunmore and its occupants Orville and Mickey Wagner were not so fortunate. Unlike the other two boats after the earthquake hit, the couple decided to get out of the bay. This might seem like a wise decision, but just as they turned out of the entrance, the wave hit them from the side. The boat flipped and was taken by the wave. The couple did not survive. It could have been a much bigger tragedy though, since two groups of campers consisting of 20 people should have been camping on the shoreline of the bay that evening. Lady Luck must have smiled on them because the two groups had decided for various reasons not to camp. Had they been there when that wave hit, they would have been taken by the waves along with the trees they were camping next to. Howard and Sonny didn't give up fishing, although a year after, Howard retired as a commercial fisherman. Bill and Vi soon recovered from their injuries, but Vi said she'd never get in a boat again. Bill did, and on May 26, 1962, almost 4 years after the accident, he returned to Lituya Bay in his boat, the St. Nicholas. It was the first time he'd been back since the accident. This man, now a 50-year-old in good health, died of a massive heart attack just as soon as his boat passed through the entrance. Looks like the wave got him in the end.
Earthquakes occur when two blocks of rock below the Earth's surface rub against each other. Where that tension happens underground is called the hypocenter, and up above, we call that the epicenter. A little rumble could be the start of bigger things to come. They are called foreshocks. The bigger shocks that come after are called the main shocks, which might be followed by aftershocks that could come a day after or many years after. We measure the power of an earthquake from 1 to 10, judging its vibrations or magnitude on what we call a seismograph. Hundreds of small earthquakes happen every day, but thankfully the huge ones are rare. A 9.5 magnitude earthquake in Chile was the most powerful ever recorded, but scientists say a 10 is possible. Today we'll focus mostly on one country. In this episode of the Infographic Show, biggest earthquakes ever, what would it take to destroy the USA? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. We will first put into perspective earthquakes in the USA when measured against quite recent earthquakes that were some of the largest in recorded history. Number 3 on the list of worst ever recorded earthquakes is one many of us old enough to remember could never forget. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, sometimes called the Christmas tsunami due to when it took place and the ensuing tidal destruction. This undersea megathrust earthquake measured 9.1 to 9.3, creating tsunamis up to 100 feet high that quickly and devastatingly encroached coastal areas in 14 countries. 230,000 to 280,000 people were killed in all, from fishing villages on the western coast of Sri Lanka to touristy hotspots in Thailand's beach towns. Number 4 on the list of worst ever recorded earthquakes is Japan's 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. This too triggered a massive tsunami reaching up to 133 feet in height. It measured 9 to 9.1. Casualties were fewer in number than the aforementioned disaster, 15,894 deaths, much in part due to Japan's infrastructure and the fact that Japan had superior warning systems. Many of the countries hit by the Asian tsunami had no idea what was coming their way, as can be seen in videos of tourists in Thailand still hanging out on the beach as the tsunami approaches. The USA is up there as having experienced one of the worst earthquakes ever, second on the list of worst ever regarding magnitude. It was the 1964 Alaskan earthquake. It too caused great damage to structures and generated its own tsunami, but the death toll at 139 was relatively small. Some of those deaths were as far away as California and Oregon, with loss of life not according to the earthquake itself, but the resultant tsunamis. While fatalities were low, the earthquake caused wide fissures in roads and forests, destroyed many buildings, brought down bridges, and wrecked rail tracks. Had that happened in a densely populated metropolis, it could have been devastating. Well, one of the USA's most populated places are the cities and surrounding areas of Los Angeles and San Francisco. According to the US Geological Survey, the US is destined to meet with a large earthquake in the not too distant future, and it could well be those areas where it happens. The worst earthquake on record in the USA did indeed happen in San Francisco in the year 1906. The 7.9 magnitude beast occurred along 300 miles of what's called the San Andreas Fault. This is a 750-mile mile-long tectonic boundary that separates the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. The earthquake brought the city to ruins, collapsing structures and causing widespread fires. It's thought that about 3,000 people died, and of course many more were injured. 28,000 buildings were destroyed in total, and 250,000 San Franciscans lost their home. This was without doubt the worst Californian earthquake in terms of casualties and destruction to buildings, but it wasn't the most powerful. That was the Fort Tejon quake of 1857 that measured 7.9 in magnitude. Apparently only one person died when his house collapsed on him. Lesser quakes in the area have had a much more devastating effect. In fact, outside of Alaska, Hawaii, South Carolina, and Idaho, all of the USA's worst earthquakes in terms of damage done have been in California. Some of them happened not that long ago. Shortly after the San Francisco disaster came the Long Beach earthquake in 1933. It only had a magnitude of 6.4 but still claimed around 120 lives as people ran from collapsing buildings. The state was criticized for not having strong enough buildings to ensure safety, and as a result the state revised building codes. Some say it was a lucky escape since over 230 school buildings were destroyed, but as it happened close to 6 p.m., kids had already left the buildings. Building codes were once again revised after the 1971 San Fernando earthquake. It measured 6.7 in magnitude and caused damage to many buildings in districts of Los Angeles and beyond. It's thought that around 58 to 65 people lost their lives, 49 of them were in one building alone, the Olive View Hospital in Sylmar. One of the survivors recalled some years after the incident, there was relief when the shaking stopped, but there were still sounds of crunching and groans. The worrying thing is the hospital was actually built with earthquake resistance in mind. Following this in 1989 and 1994, California experienced two more earthquakes resulting in loss of life. The 1989 Loma Prieta 6.9 earthquake was the first deadly earthquake to hit San Francisco Bay since the 1906 disaster, and it took 63 lives. Most of those people succumbed to a collapsed highway in Oakland. The 94 quake hit Northridge in Southern California and measured 6.7. 60 people died, this time because their houses were structurally weak. When scientists are asked which large cities are the most likely to be hit by a big earthquake in the next 20 or 30 years, one that measures over 6.7, places in California are high on the list. The world's largest, most populated city, Tokyo, is also up there. As we write this, just recently a 7.1 magnitude earthquake hit central Mexico, causing buildings to collapse in the densely populated capital of Mexico City. The full death toll is expected to be more than the 216 that has already been reported. But the question we ask today is, what would it take to destroy entire cities in the USA, or even destroy the entire country? First of all, scientists say what we already know from this show so far, that the worst earthquakes that could hit the USA would very likely be in Alaska or in California. The scientists say one of the worst places is the Cascadia subduction zone, the coast from California all the way up to Canada. They believe a 9.0 magnitude quake is very much possible, and if one happened of this size in the coastal region, it would generate huge tsunamis that would envelop the American West Coast. The last one happened in 1700, and they believe we are due for another any time in the next 400 years. According to Live Science, even though the San Andreas Fault is seen as a more dangerous area, it is thought a quake of more than 8.0 is unlikely. Former US Geological Survey scientist Jim Birkeland, who once had a book written about him called The Man Who Predicts Earthquakes, has gone on record stating that one of these regions is due for a big one soon. He has been right a few times in the past. While California has taken the headlines for a long time regarding mass destruction by earthquakes, more recent reports suggest that the Midwest could also be an accident waiting to happen. In 1811 and 1812, a quake of 7.5 magnitude occurred along the New Madrid seismic zone in New Madrid, Missouri. That was once thought to be a one-off, but now science tells us it could happen again. This could potentially wreak havoc in Missouri, Mississippi, Illinois, Indiana, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. A large city such as New York has suffered minor earthquakes in the past, but as it doesn't sit on any major fault line, it's unlikely to experience a big quake. Its biggest ever was in 1884 and measured 5.3, and some media suggest another is on its way. In fact, according to the US Geological Survey, 42 of the 50 states will likely experience a damaging earthquake in the next 50 years, but none so threatening as the one expected in the Sunshine State. Less reputable media have reported on a mega quake that could rip apart the US and kill millions, but so far science is not backing that up. According to the Smithsonian, the all-out destruction depicted in the movie San Andreas is way more fiction than fact. If something big does go down, the magazine says that even the largest of California's quakes won't be felt by anything but seismometers on the East Coast. A scientist did say, though, that when the big one comes, and it will likely unleash destruction on many levels. It's thought that roughly 2,000 people will die, and a lot of the damage will come from fires. Be prepared, said another scientist. Everyone should live every day like it could be the day of the big one, he said, because any day, even today, could be that day.
When it comes to the most severe weather in the world, it doesn't really get more extreme than hurricanes and tornadoes. As anyone who's ever been lucky enough to survive one will tell you, both of these meteorological phenomena are positively terrifying. and pose a massive danger to human safety, as well as threatening to cause huge levels of damage to towns and cities. They can vary significantly in their size, scale, and how much destruction they leave in their wake, as well as how and where they form and how long they go on for. But between a hurricane and a tornado, which of them is worse? There's only one way to find out, and hopefully for your sake, it isn't through experiencing both to compare. For starters, let's compare the key similarities and differences between hurricanes and tornadoes. After all, before we determine which is the more destructive force of nature, we should make sure that we know what sets them apart. A hurricane is defined as a form of tropical cyclone that has sustained winds traveling over 74 miles per hour. They're often accompanied by rain, thunder, and lightning, as well as being symmetrical with a clearly defined center. Tornadoes, on the other hand, are rotating columns of air that range in width from anywhere between a few yards to over a mile wide. The winds that form a tornado spin destructively fast, causing clouds to form a funnel shape created by the pull and the speed of the winds, which can fall anywhere between 40 to 300 plus miles per hour in more extreme cases. A key factor characterizing both tornadoes and hurricanes is that they both are the result of instability in atmospheric conditions. Hurricanes and tornadoes normally consist of extremely high winds that are traveling horizontally around the circumferences of a central point. Closer to the center of each storm, there are additional winds traveling in an upward motion, and these surround the innermost center where the winds are traveling vertically down. Forming in the Earth's southern hemisphere, both will rotate clockwise, and in the northern hemisphere, their rotation will be counterclockwise. The first and most notable difference between both is in their formation. Tornadoes are distinctly characterized by their vertical structure, winding upward toward the sky. Even though they can often look like a windswept column coming down to Earth from the clouds above, tornadoes actually form from the ground up. This is contrary to the long-accepted theory that tornadoes are first born several miles up from the ground, thanks to high-speed winds at cloud level. However, after researchers analyzed 4 tornadoes from Oklahoma to Kansas, they discovered a disparity between radar measurements of wind speeds and the photos and videos taken by local storm chasers. While the funnel of the tornado was already on the ground, it took several minutes for the radar data from around 250 meters above ground to detect any change in the wind. Comparing these with radar measurements taken near the ground, they found the rapid rotation began much lower than previously believed. Their findings redetermined how weather forecasters predict tornadoes. Beforehand, they would rely on measurements of wind speeds higher up in the clouds, while a tornado could already be forming out of swirling winds lower down near the ground. Knowing this distinction is vital to predicting tornadoes and sounding the alarm as early as possible before they hit. In contrast to the vertical formation of a tornado, hurricanes stretch out horizontally in scales that are roughly 1,000 times bigger. They also take much longer to form, which can often, although sadly not always, allow for more time to prepare for them. Normally, a hurricane's approach will be detected within a few weeks to days of it hitting an area, and this location can be determined usually within that time frame. However, the trade-off is that the lifespan of a hurricane is usually several days long, meaning while you're likely to get more warning if a hurricane is inbound, it also means it'll be there to stay for a while. Meanwhile, tornadoes are almost frighteningly quick to form. Even with the important knowledge that the faster wind speeds preceding one will be closer to the ground, a tornado can form within minutes, making it much harder to prepare for. Living in an area that's more prone to tornadoes will likely mean residents have to be prepared for the possibility of one forming at almost all times, such as in the Midwest United States and other places where there's a convergence between cold and warm fronts. If you aren't ready for a tornado to hit, warnings can usually only be given a few hours to mere minutes before one appears. While the weather conditions that indicate the possibility of a tornado are predictable a few hours before a storm, they will rarely give more than a few short minutes of warning. And sometimes they offer none at all, and they hit when you least expect. Additionally, what makes tornadoes so tenacious is that, as well as being harder to predict, they occur a lot more frequently too. While they can happen almost anywhere in the world, in the United States alone, it's estimated there are around 1,200 tornadoes in a single year. That's considerably more than the average of 10 to 15 hurricanes that can occur within that same time frame. While you might associate the sight of a tornado with some of the more rural parts of the US, it's actually the Netherlands that experiences the highest number of tornadoes per area when compared to other countries. Usually forming in either spring or autumn, one saving grace of most tornadoes is that despite their frequency, destructive potential, and difficulty in detection, they don't often go on for very long. A tornado is normally over within a few minutes, far less time than the days a hurricane can go on for. Additionally, they'll normally only consist of a single storm, while hurricanes can be formed of several cumulative storms that occur simultaneously and merge together. So we've determined the key differences between tornadoes and hurricanes, but before we go any further, we have a question for you. Do you sometimes feel like there's a tornado or even a hurricane inside of your mind? The kind that interferes with your happiness or prevents you from achieving your goals? Regardless of if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human who lives in the world and is going through a hard time, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, and this is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/infographics. Clicking that link helps support the channel, but it also gives you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing with therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/infographics. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. Now back to hurricanes and tornadoes. We've talked about the main differences between them, namely the ways in which they form and the conditions that cause them. Another noteworthy difference is that both storms can bring with them different forms of precipitation, with hurricanes known to also carry severe rains on their extreme winds. Tornadoes, on the other hand, given how quickly they whip up the wind, can pull in not only rain but also sleet and hail too, meaning that if you're caught out when one of those hits, there will be a lot more than the rapidly spinning column of wind and the cloud to worry about. But of these two meteorological heavy hitters, which one packs more punch? Surely it's tornadoes, right? After all, they spring up quicker, with fewer warnings, and at a far more frequent rate, affecting almost every continent on Earth. Well, let's take a look at some of the most destructive tornadoes and hurricanes on record and determine once and for all which is worse. The deadliest tornado ever recorded in the history of the United States is referred to as the Tri-State Tornado. It occurred on March 18, 1925. In Ellington, Missouri, the day had been otherwise normal. The weather forecast called for an average day with nothing out of the ordinary reporting. Interestingly, at the time, the word tornado was actually banned from weather forecasts in the US and had been since the late 19th century, so as to not incite panic among the public. And yet, despite not being predicted by meteorologists, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon that day, a tornado did indeed materialize. The storm moved at a rapid rate to the northeast, tearing through three Missouri towns, Annapolis, Beale, and Frona, before it reached the Mississippi River. The tornado had already claimed 11 lives. It then crossed the river to southern Illinois, laying waste to another three towns, Gorham, DeSoto, and Murfreesboro. Of the three in the tornado's path, Murfreesboro was hit the hardest, suffering 234 fatalities. More than 600 people died in Illinois before the Tri-State Tornado once again crossed another river, this time heading over the Wabash River into Indiana. It was the fact that it hit these three states, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, that earned the storm its nickname of the Tri-State Tornado. In Indiana, the tornado was able to demolish much of the towns of Princeton, Griffin, and Owensville, with about 85 rural farms being destroyed by the speed and force of the winds. 71 residents of these Indiana towns lost their lives before the tornado eventually dissipated a mere 3.5 hours after it formed at 4:30 p.m. In the immediate aftermath, fires and looting broke out in the affected areas, exacerbating the tornado's already devastating effects. The wind speeds of the Tri-State Tornado were roughly 300 miles per hour. This was fast enough to classify it as an EF5 tornado. Tornadoes are rated on what is known as the Enhanced Fujita Scale, or EF scale, which assigns each tornado a rating based on its estimated wind speeds and the overall damage a storm causes during its lifespan. EF5 tornadoes are those capable of causing lasting structural damage and sometimes even utterly destroying apartments, condominiums, and townhouses. The Tri-State Tornado was able to travel a considerable distance, that being 219 miles, in only 3.5 hours. This set the highest record for both the duration and distance of a tornado, making it one of the largest and fastest tornadoes in US history. All of that would be a lot more impressive if it hadn't come at such a high cost. And sadly, we don't just mean how much it would have cost to repair all the property damage. In total, across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, nearly 700 people lost their lives to the tri-state tornado, with well over 2,000 of the survivors left injured, many of them also finding themselves homeless without food, thanks to the storm destroying their homes and farms. The tri-state tornado was not a storm to be sniffed at, but comparatively, let's take a look at one of the most dangerous hurricanes to ever hit the US, Hurricane Sandy. When this superstorm hit land in 2012, it was aptly described as a raging freak of nature. On October 22nd, a tropical depression formed in the northeast coast of Nicaragua in the Caribbean Sea, an area that's perhaps the most affected by hurricanes in the world. Within only 2 short days, this depression, which is a low-pressure atmospheric system forming in the tropics, had become a Category 1 hurricane. Much like tornadoes, there exists a scale for determining the severity of a hurricane known as the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale. The scale applies a rating from 1 to 5 based on the maximum sustained wind speed of a storm and attempts to estimate the potential property damage a hurricane might cause. However, this doesn't include the additional possible damage that can befall an area as a result of other natural hazards that can form as a result of a hurricane. For example, storm surges, flooding that's caused by the rainfall, and even tornadoes don't factor into the category a hurricane falls into. From its origin point in the Caribbean Sea, Hurricane Sandy started to move northeast, passing over Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and then Haiti. Here it caused massive amounts of rain, which in turn triggered mudslides that ended at least 50 Haitian lives. 4 days later, on October 26, 2012, much of Cuba's historic city of Santiago de Cuba was damaged when Sandy passed over Cuba and Puerto Rico. As it continued to traverse northward, the storm weakened, reverting back into a tropical depression when it reached the Bahamas. However, it didn't take long to surge back once again into a Category 1 hurricane. This reforming structure was unusual, caused by warm waters that allowed the storm to grow with a huge radius of 100 miles. Next, Sandy would progress upwards toward the east coast, staying a few hundred miles from the shores for a time. Passing north in South Carolina, the hurricane was able to push large waves and massive amounts of rain to shore, causing some roads in the Outer Banks to be washed away. Hurricane Sandy then collided with a cold front that had been heading east toward the Atlantic Ocean, which unleashed havoc on Delaware and New Jersey. The storm was then essentially trapped by another high-pressure storm moving in from the north. Hurricane Sandy had now become a superstorm, stretching 1,000 miles along the east coast of the United States. Given that at the time a full moon was affecting the tides, this only added to the storm surge, sending water ashore by a foot more than normal. Sandy did lose its hurricane structure as it mixed in with the cooler air coming from mainland, but the intense winds it had caused remained and eventually hit both New York and New Jersey. Much of lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Staten Island was rapidly flooded, which also caused massive problems for New York's subway system. Superstorm Sandy then caused an influx of snow to hit West Virginia and North Carolina. During the course of the storm, well over 8 million homes were left without power, with outages lasting several days in many major cities. In more outlying areas, this lasted for multiple weeks. Eventually, the storm started to dissipate on October 30th, heading inland before it was ultimately gone by the time it reached Pennsylvania. But even as the remaining vestiges of Hurricane Sandy winds moved west, the immense size of the storm meant that storm surges continued in New York, and additional flooding came as a result. At its biggest point, Hurricane Sandy covered an entire quarter of the continental US. Part of the reason that Hurricane Sandy was so deadly was due to the fact that most weather models used for predicting these types of storms had projected that this one would simply head out to sea instead of striking the US. Local weather offices were told by the National Hurricane Center to issue hurricane advisories when it became obvious that Sandy posed a danger. But even after these warnings, many normal people simply chose not to evacuate. A number of homes along the East Coast were destroyed, particularly at the Jersey Shore and within Staten Island. Even 5 years later, some residents of these areas were still rebuilding, while some made the choice to relocate to areas on higher ground. Thousands were made temporarily homeless, with over 20,000 households displaced after Sandy hit. While Hurricane Sandy might not have been as strong as some of the other infamous hurricanes, it was owing to a combination of weather factors and the fact that most of the US was unprepared for it that allowed the storm to cause such a high level of damage. It's since been recorded as the 4th most expensive storm in US history. More than 600,000 homes were destroyed in just New Jersey and New York combined. An estimated $19 billion worth of damage was caused in New York City alone. 117 people lost their lives during the storm, or as a result of the flooding it caused in the 24 states that were affected. Compare the cost incurred in one city as a result of Hurricane Sandy to the financial impact of the most expensive tornado in U.S. history. That accolade goes to another EF5 tornado that struck Joplin, Missouri on the afternoon of May 22, 2011. Part of what made this particular storm so devastating to the area was that it was a multiple vertex tornado, which, as the name suggests, is a storm that consists of multiple smaller, rapidly spinning tornadoes known as subvortices. These subvortices usually occur briefly for only a few minutes at a time, but during that time they're able to cause a devastating amount of damage. In the case of the 2011 Joplin tornado, this storm began rapidly forming just west of the city as part of a much larger outbreak of tornadoes that occurred in the Midwest and southern United States in May 2011. The tornado reached a maximum width of over a mile, with its wind speeds reaching up to a breakneck 200 miles per hour. It traveled around 6 miles heading eastward through Joplin, then continuing into rural portions of Jasper and Newton County. A large portion of the city of Joplin was left devastated by the tornado, approximately 10 to 20% of the whole city. Nearly 8,000 buildings sustained damage, and over 4,000 were outright destroyed. This even included one of the city's major hospitals. Although it only lasted for less than an hour, the 2011 Joplin tornado cost almost $3 billion in damages, paid out by insurance companies in the wake of the storm, although the estimated total damages are believed to be significantly more than the amount that was paid out. The lives of 161 people were claimed that day, making it not only the costliest tornado in U.S. history, but also the 7th deadliest on record and 27th worldwide. Several billion dollars in damages is hardly a negligible amount, but how does that fare against one of the costliest hurricanes to ever hit the U.S.? Somehow, around $3 billion is a mere drop in the bucket when compared to the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina. Much like Sandy and many others, Hurricane Katrina began to form in the Caribbean Sea as a tropical depression in August of 2005. However, while the storm itself would later go on to cause significant damage and loss of life, a number of infrastructure problems within the United States only exacerbated the decimation caused by the storm. The tropical depression that would later become the devastating hurricane initially intensified as it made its way from the Bahamas, where it had formed, heading westward toward Florida. As it made its way further, it gradually increased in strength until eventually making its initial landfall on August 25th. It was only categorized as a hurricane 2 hours before hitting Hallandale Beach in southern Florida. At that point, it was only a Category 1 hurricane as it moved further across Florida, and a day later it looked to be weakening back down to a tropical storm. However, Katrina would suddenly and rapidly intensify as it passed over the Gulf of Mexico, thanks to the warm water in the area. This took the hurricane up to a Category 5, then eventually weakened only slightly to a Category 3 as it made its second landfall over Mississippi and southern parts of Louisiana. This return to land brought with it wind speeds of 125 miles per hour, generating rainfall of between 8 and 12 inches. In the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, officials issued a mandatory evacuation order. However, as Hurricane Katrina reached the city, massive amounts of flooding occurred as a result. Engineering flaws in the flood protection system meant that water overfilled the levee around the city, causing it to break and the streets to flood. As a result, 80% of the city of New Orleans was left underwater. The flooding destroyed most of New Orleans' transportation and communication facilities, meaning that those who were still in the city before Katrina's landfall had hardly any access to basic necessities like food and shelter. Hurricane Katrina left residents who weren't able to evacuate from New Orleans stranded in their homes, with water rising all around them. Around 40% of the many deaths related to Katrina were the result of drowning, thanks to the level of flooding. Unfortunately, the federal government's delayed reaction in aiding citizens led many to claim that their incompetence was a deliberate disregard for many of the economically disadvantaged people and the many people of color who were affected the worst. Beyond New Orleans, the effects of Hurricane Katrina were felt throughout the eastern United States. The storm had even an impact on the oil industry, as multiple oil platforms and drilling rigs in the Gulf of Mexico were either damaged or displaced. 30 of these platforms were reported to have been lost thanks to Katrina. The wind speeds of Hurricane Katrina reached upward of 150 miles per hour. That might be considered relatively slow for a tornado. One with those wind speeds would likely fall only between the first and second two rankings on the enhanced Fujita scale. However, in the case of a hurricane like Katrina, the sheer distance it was able to cover from the time it formed on August 23rd to the time it dissipated on August 31st meant that the amount of damage it caused was far higher than any single tornado. It's likely that had the government invested in improving the infrastructure of New Orleans, then Katrina might have caused less damage than it actually did. Sadly, though, the effects of the hurricane were nothing short of devastating. 1,836 lives were lost, as well as resulting in damages totaling up to $161 billion, making it the single costliest hurricane in U.S. history. So, where does that leave us? Well, let's do a total comparison between both hurricanes and tornadoes. In the case of both, the longer they go on for, the further they're able to travel during that time, and the more damage they'll be able to cause. But as you might have noticed, the number of fatalities and the cost of the damages incurred during both Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Katrina are astronomically higher than most tornadoes. Although the loss of 695 people due to the tri-state tornado is still a tragically high number. An additional 1,104 people sadly lost their lives during Hurricane Katrina. While tornadoes might often rapidly reach faster wind speeds in shorter times and cause havoc on the ground, they typically go on for only a few minutes each time. And apart from the few rare exceptions, they normally don't travel more than a few miles in their short lifespan, which mercifully limits the amount of damage and fatalities they're able to cause between their formation and dissipation. Another bit of key information to note is that tornadoes don't impact the overall circulation of the atmosphere, given that while they might have the speed, they don't have the size and overall circumference to affect weather on more than a local scale, usually affecting single towns or cities at the worst. On the other hand, hurricanes are capable of traveling thousands of miles from the time they form to the time they dissipate, which can often go on for several days to as long as weeks in the most extreme cases. To make matters even worse, the size and scope of most hurricanes mean they do have a measurable effect on the circulation of the global atmosphere. While they might not form as spontaneously as tornadoes, and generally their wind speeds don't move as quickly, hurricanes have a longevity that makes them dangerous. The expansive areas they can impact mean that hurricanes can leave more in the way of lasting damage, with multiple cities and even multiple states all being affected by a single storm. The key deciding factor when it comes down to which is worse between hurricanes and tornadoes is ultimately their differences in scale. While a strong tornado might have wind speeds far exceeding that of a strong hurricane, the size of an affected area by a hurricane is typically much larger than that affected by a tornado. Comparatively, on average, the damage caused annually by tornadoes only racks up to about a tenth the cost of the overall damage caused by hurricanes. Given their much larger size, their longer duration, and the wider variety of impact they can have on the weather and environment, of the two, hurricanes are often far worse than tornadoes. We just hope none of you loyal Infographics viewers ever have to experience either. We need to get the people off the rig. We may not be able to hold the rig. The rig might be going over. The foreman's desperate cry crackled over the emergency radio, his voice barely audible over the deafening storm. The Ocean Ranger, once a towering fortress in the sea, was under siege. Huge waves crashed against it from all sides as frigid water poured in. In the chaos, the men fought for life jackets, their only hope for survival, as others made a more desperate choice, leaping from the gigantic oil rig into the ocean below. Those left aboard watched and were faced with a terrifying reality. Would they soon be meeting the same fate? Only a few hours earlier, the Ocean Ranger had been standing upright in the sea. Now the gigantic oil rig was leaning dangerously far over, tilting closer and closer to the roaring waves, as if the ocean itself was determined to pull the enormous vessel under the inky black surface. How did it all go so wrong? How did this unstoppable force of engineering become a death trap? And with time running out, could anyone survive the rig's final moments? They thought it was unsinkable. Even though the crew aboard all called it a rig, the Ocean Ranger was technically a self-propelled drilling platform designed to be semi-submersible. At the time, it was by far the largest platform of its kind ever built, weighing 25,000 tons, or 28,000 short tons, and standing at roughly the height of a 33-story building. While it towered over the crew aboard the main deck, almost an entire third of the Ocean Ranger itself was concealed deep beneath the water. 80 feet below the waves were a pair of 400-foot pontoons, equipped with ballast tanks that could be filled with water to keep the rig afloat in harsh seas. In theory, it should have been able to take whatever the ocean threw at it, unsinkable, or so they thought. They were drilling in the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, 166 miles or 267 kilometers away from the Canadian mainland. The rig was burrowing 1,500 feet deep into the oil and natural gas reserves below the ocean floor. It was in an area known for dangerous weather, particularly in the winter months. The crew aboard the Ocean Ranger had trusted that the rig would be enough to protect them from the sheer force of the sea. But that trust would offer them little protection against the combined forces of the elements, like opening an umbrella to fend off a hurricane. February 14, 1982. That morning, the crew listened to the weather forecasts, the reporters warning that a harsh winter storm with winds of 90 knots and waves of up to 37 feet was rolling toward the Grand Banks, thanks to a large cyclone further out in the Atlantic. But none of them worried all that much. The rig was designed to withstand those weather conditions, so nobody saw any immediate cause for concern. Most of the crew had even seen it standing firm against powerful waves and storms before. The harsh winter weather conditions near the Grand Banks hadn't been understated to the crew of hardened oilmen. But still, not one of them aboard had any reason to believe that this next storm would be any different than the last. After all, why would it? Famous last words. The crew still had to prepare the rig and everyone aboard for the incoming storm. Some were responsible for finding any equipment that was likely to be carried overboard by the fearsome winds and securing it in place. Others were tasked with meticulously checking that weather-tight portholes and doors were properly sealed. Then, most critical of all was the need to manage the ballast tanks below. The ballast control system mediated the amount of seawater going into or out of the tanks, meaning they could maintain the Ocean Ranger's buoyancy in response to the wild, unruly waters below. If that failed, they were all as good as dead. But the crew knows that the Ranger is a sturdy beast. It's designed to withstand 110-foot tall waves and wind speeds of up to 100 knots. Despite how intense this incoming storm was reported to be, it does little to deter the crew from going about their day-to-day duties after the appropriate safety measures have been taken. But they wouldn't be nearly enough in the face of the storm that was approaching. Little did any of the crew know the storm would bring waves that would decimate all of the Ocean Ranger's defenses. Whether driven by their belief that the Ocean Ranger could withstand the weather, or out of fear of reprisals from their superiors at Odeco Inc. and Mobil if they abandoned their station, the crew persevered. As the long stormy night rolled on, conditions in the rig made it harder to work. The rain was bad enough, working in tandem with the fierce winds of 80 knots or 92 miles per hour to freeze the men to the bone. It was dark out at sea, even with the lights aboard the Ranger. Visibility was poor. Drilling quickly became an uphill battle. The rig's systems required constant monitoring, most crucially the ballast control system, and the crew was spread dangerously thin. Before long, the waves battering the Ocean Ranger began to climb, increasing in height and gradually pushing the limits of what the rig could withstand. The crew was in constant radio communication with the shore, as well as other rigs in the area too, keeping them all up to speed on the situation out at sea while the drilling continued. 7:15 p.m. A radio transmission reached the Sedco 706. The crew aboard the neighboring oil platform overheard some internal communications from the Ocean Ranger, reporting that the waves were getting bigger, with some being between 55 and 65 feet. There was also something about a broken porthole and water seeping into the rig itself. Only moments before, a rogue wave had come rolling toward the Ocean Ranger, one far larger and stronger than the others in the storm. The oil rig had already been pushed to its limits, bombarded by increasingly powerful waves, and this was the one that hit it the hardest. The wave directly struck the side of the Ocean Ranger with such force that it shattered one of the porthole windows, one that just so happened to be in the ballast control room. A huge rush of icy water surged into one of the most essential rooms of the entire rig, home to the system that was vital for keeping the Ocean Ranger stable. Each subsequent wave that hit the rig now had a way in. The impending flood quickly destroyed the tech in the ballast control room. The porthole wasn't a large opening, but it was big enough for seawater to gush inside with each big wave. The porthole itself was only 25 feet from the ocean surface. Any wave higher than that was bringing more and more water aboard. 9 p.m. The radio operator aboard the nearby Sedco oil platform overheard another transmission from the Ocean Ranger. Their crew says there's something seriously wrong with their rig's ballast control valves. They now seem to be opening and closing of their own accord. Back on the Ocean Ranger, the furious waters and now inoperable ballast tanks below caused the whole rig to list and tilt violently beneath the crew's feet. There was one hope, a way to manually control the ballast tanks. But the storm was only getting worse. Beneath the ocean surface, more water floods the forward chain lockers located in the front-facing support columns for the rig. Thanks to the broken porthole in the ballast control room and the Ocean Ranger tilting forward, the forward chain lockers let in enough water that the corner support columns began to flood. The seawater levels inside the rig began to climb, eventually spilling out onto the upper deck. Splashes underfoot become ankle deep. Then they rose to the knee, crewmen needing to wade through rising water. The moment that the flooding spread to the oil platform, it looked like the vessel would capsize, plunging everyone on board under the icy depths of the storm-frenzied sea. Meanwhile, the crew inside the ballast control room were still battling the elements while trying to stabilize the Ocean Ranger. But water wasn't the only problem. Not one of them had been trained properly. There had been a startling lack of crew training for those aboard the Ocean Ranger. The crew had no idea how to operate the ballast control system, even without the added panic of the storm and the water disrupting the system. While trying to fix the problem, the crew aboard the Ocean Ranger had accidentally increased the forward list of the rig, making the situation far, far worse. 12:52 a.m. The early hours of February 15, 1982. The Ocean Ranger broadcast a mayday, reporting that their platform was listing badly. An emergency vessel standing by, the MV Seaforth Highlander, sailed out to assist. Within 10 minutes of the alarming message hitting the airwaves, helicopters owned by Mobil and the Canadian Coast Guard were in the air, heading toward the rig. Hospitals in St. John's on the mainland were told to be on standby. Out at sea, despite help being on the way, the bow of the Ocean Ranger continued to dip lower, while at the same time, the stern of the rig was raised up out of the water. The ballast control system was located in the stern, meaning that those inside were losing their footing and risking serious injury as the room around them started to tilt. To make matters worse, the pumps used to fill the ballast tanks with water didn't have sufficient power to send the water up such a steep incline now that the stern was rising out of the water. Each hour, the list of the Ocean Ranger got worse, looking more and more like the crew were either going to need to abandon the rig or die aboard it. So the call was made and emergency procedures were quickly underway. All drilling operations had already been halted, but it was now time to start seriously considering a full-scale evacuation of the Ocean Ranger. Crew members raced up and down the lengths of the listing rig to shut down any systems that weren't deemed essential. Everyone had to turn their focus toward crisis management. But as if the severity of the storm, malfunctioning equipment, and the increasing tilt of the platform weren't enough to contend with, just like when it came to regaining control of the ballast system, the company hadn't provided the crew with formal training in the safety procedures for the Ocean Ranger, including evacuation procedures. They were on their own, working off what experience they had with emergencies like this, which was limited at best, and not helped by the safety features aboard the Ocean Ranger being inadequate as well. The standby vessels on their way to help had also been given no safety protocols to follow, which would mean they'd be unable to rescue any crew members that successfully evacuated aboard lifeboats. The Canadian Coast Guard on their way to aid the crew of the Ocean Ranger exercised their right to sequester other boats to assist in an emergency, enlisting the support of the MV Boltentor and MV Nordator. These were standby vessels for the Sedco 706 and another nearby platform, Zapata Ugland, respectively. However, those boats, along with the MV Seaforth Highlander, had to fight against the same elements that were battering the Ocean Ranger. The high winds and turbulent waters were prohibiting safe approach for the boats, making it just as big of a risk to the lives of the rescue teams as the crew they were sailing out to assist. Still, while the crew aboard were trying desperately to find an exit strategy, the support vessels were braving the violent stormy waters. They had every intention of reaching the unstable platform and evacuating the crew on board. But the harsh conditions were making it all the more challenging. But the ongoing storm wasn't the only factor hindering the rescue attempts. The standby vessels were still woefully ill-equipped for the task and hadn't been properly configured to rescue Ocean Ranger crew members if they managed to make their way off the rig and into the icy seas below. 1:30 a.m. The final message from the Ocean Ranger was transmitted. There will be no further radio communications from Ocean Ranger. Comes the foreboding broadcast from the radio operator. We are going to lifeboat stations. Afterward, the support vessels could hear nothing. The other platforms listening in for radio chatter only received static. The Ocean Ranger had gone silent. Aboard the rig, the crew was in the midst of an evacuation attempt. It wasn't as simple as hopping into a lifeboat and sailing to the safety of the shore. It was a frenzy, scores of people clamoring to get off the sinking rig. Many were either trying to barge their way to being aboard one of the first lifeboats or were desperately gathering up any essential survival gear they could carry. Some were putting the rest of the crew before themselves and ensuring that the life jackets had been passed out among the men, fastening and securing them ready to go. Others were trying desperately to ready the lifeboats for departure, as the Ocean Ranger listed and tilted more and more around them. Almost as horrifying as the rig tilting all around them was the knowledge among some crew that even if they made it off the Ocean Ranger, there was a reason that evacuation was a last resort. A lifeboat was not a ticket to safety. It was just an exchange, swapping a huge vessel that had already been ravaged by the sea for a tiny one that could just as easily be swept away by the waves. Even getting free from the Ocean Ranger, the crewmen still would be at the mercy of the elements, thrown about on the water, while huddled together in the hopes that one of the rescue teams would both see them and be able to reach them in the storm. While some crew tried desperately to prepare for evacuation with little preparation or training to equip them for an emergency like this, others were starting to panic. Tensions were climbing. Some of the men were still confused as to what had happened, while others were anxious to abandon the Ocean Ranger before the rig became their watery tomb. But not one of them was ignorant of the terrifying, inescapable truth. All of their lives were at stake. The lifeboats aboard the Ocean Ranger, like many, were designed to launch in adverse and extreme conditions, but not many are intended to launch at the angle the oil platform was now listing. In particular, the lifeboats aboard the Ocean Ranger relied on gravity to drop directly down into the water, meaning the rig needed to be relatively level, which it certainly was not anymore. But in a minor miracle, one of the lifeboats was able to successfully launch, containing up to 36 members of the crew, all jammed inside the tiny vessel. Sometime after the lifeboat had hit the water, the MV Seaforth Highlander support boat arrived in the area, only to see bodies floating in the water. There were 20 crew members at least floating in the choppy seas, according to the later reports by witnesses aboard the standby vessel. Combined with the others aboard the lifeboat, that made a total of 56 who had made it to the water one way or another. 2:21 a.m. The MV Seaforth Highlander spotted emergency flares and began moving toward one of the lifeboats. It drifted toward the standby vessel, containing a handful of the Ocean Ranger's crew members. As it pulled up alongside them, the rescue team aboard the Seaforth was able to hurriedly throw lines to the lifeboat and started to pull it closer through the ocean. But the storm was still swirling the waters into a maelstrom, and before anyone could be helped out of the lifeboat and brought aboard the Seaforth Highlander, the small vessel was hammered hard against the hull of the support vessel. More heavy waves caused the line to suddenly snap and overturn the lifeboat. It capsized in the freezing North Atlantic waters, leaving the few men clambering out of the lifeboat now clinging to its sides for dear life, soaked and chilled to the bone, their hands numb from the icy water. The MV Seaforth Highlander fought through the swelling waves to reach the men, but it was already too late. By the time the boat reached them, the cold had already taken them. Only one of the Ocean Ranger crew was seen in a bright orange life jacket. The Seaforth Highlander almost chopped him to pieces with its propellers as it tried moving into position to save him. The rescue crew aboard hurled a grappling hook into the water, attempting to pull the man aboard. Even though it hooked onto his life jacket, the man soon slipped out of sight beneath the water. Desperately trying to save anyone from the Ocean Ranger, the rescue team aboard the Seaforth realized they couldn't pull someone from waters as violent as these, the towering waves making it dangerous to attempt to save any of the men drowning or freezing to death. As if battling with the tall icy waves and powerful winds whipped up by the storm wasn't hard enough, the standby vessels just hadn't been equipped for an emergency of this scale. 2:30 a.m. The Coast Guard and Mobil-owned rescue helicopters had arrived. Much like the standby vessels, they struggled to approach, thanks to the severity of the storm. One made its way to hover over the first man that the crew spotted and lowered a rescuer down to pluck the Ocean Ranger crewman from the sea, but he was already dead. The choppers battled against the wind speeds of 90 miles per hour, but even with the struggle to stay airborne in those conditions, the thrashing of the sea made it nearly impossible to recover bodies from the waters below. Instead, the best that the helicopters could do was try to guide the support ships toward the bodies that were floating through the ocean. But trying to get closer, it was clear to the crews aboard the Seaforth Highlander and the other sequestered boats that they were putting themselves in harm's way. The men out on the deck trying to recover the bodies risked being knocked overboard themselves by the freezing cold waves, potentially joining the Ocean Ranger's crew in their grim fate. 2:45 a.m. Another of the rescue teams reported that they could see the Ocean Ranger. The platform was still listing heavily, waves crashing over onto the main deck, which should have been standing high above the sea level. From a distance, there didn't look to be anyone left on board, and all the lifeboats were gone. They could have been swept up by the storm, or perhaps the remaining crew had managed to launch them. Continuing to search the waters, the standby vessels and the helicopters working in tandem could find 2 more of the lifeboats and a handful of the inflatable life rafts from the Ocean Ranger. Each one had no one on board. One of the boats found one lifeboat that was carrying the bodies of several more crew members inside, but the rescue crew were unable to recover it, thanks to the storm. That lifeboat was never seen again. By the time the rescue helicopters had arrived, it was already too late. They could do little more than provide a futile gesture of assisting the boats below, but they were having just as hard of a time navigating through the stormy weather. Each and every member of the Ocean Ranger's crew was dead. Those who made it off the rig had either succumbed to hypothermia or drowned, and those who didn't, if they had survived aboard the capsizing platform, likely didn't live for very much longer. The Ocean Ranger was listing so severely that it was no longer stable. 3:13 a.m. The Ocean Ranger oil rig capsized completely and disappeared beneath the waterline, gone from sight and plummeting down to the bottom of the ocean. The disaster was finally over, and no one had survived. Despite the numerous attempts by standby vessels and helicopters to rescue crewmen from the water, not one succeeded. The wave that started it all by crashing through the Ocean Ranger's porthole and damaging the ballast control system had taken 84 lives, every single member of the crew. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the search and rescue operation had now become a recovery mission. Over the next few days, of the 84 crew members on board, only 22 of the bodies were recovered from the North Atlantic Ocean and brought to Pier 17 Harbor. A few days later, debris from the Ocean Ranger and the crew's personal effects washed up on the shores of Newfoundland. Once the storm out in the North Atlantic had subsided, the combined forces of the Canadian military and the United States Coast Guard conducted an extensive search for whatever was still left of the Ocean Ranger. Over several weeks after the sinking, they used sonar to sweep the surrounding area of the ocean the platform had gone down in. The wreckage was eventually found almost 500 feet to the southeast of the wellhead it had been operating in before the storm hit. The main structure of the Ocean Ranger lay 260 feet below the water on the ocean floor, surrounded by its own debris, everything that had been broken off during the storm, including the oil rig's derrick and the cranes on board, now lay strewn about like bones on the seabed. Determining that the ruins of the Ocean Ranger were resting shallow enough to be a hazard to marine life and seafaring vessels alike, the sunken wreckage was floated and towed toward deeper waters, where it was allowed to sink once more, just another watery grave. Day 1. It's June 15th, 2028, and NASA has to accept a simple fact. It was wrong. Back in 2004, an asteroid named Apophis was discovered by David Tholen, Fabrizio Bernardi, and Roy Tucker at Kitt Peak National Observatory in Tucson, Arizona. The name, inspired by the Egyptian myth of a demon serpent that wreaks havoc and confusion on the world, seemed to pose a terrible threat to the planet when it was found. NASA thought it was on a collision course with Earth, setting 2029 as the date. Further observations took place. Eventually, NASA and its Planetary Defense Office were confident enough to state that their initial assessment was wrong. Apophis wouldn't hit Earth. Instead, it would pass just 19,800 miles above it, the first asteroid to do so in over 7,500 years. Still, NASA couldn't be certain. That's why it was relying on a spacecraft launched all the way back in 2016 to track the asteroid and provide more details about its composition. The spacecraft did just that, but it also delivered some terrible news. Apophis wouldn't pass by Earth. It was going to hit it. Day 2. NASA's scrambling. It hasn't told anybody the news yet because its top scientists still need to run some calculations. They need to confirm the hit. All NASA-supported telescopes are trained on the asteroid's course, including the Catalina Sky Survey in Tucson, Arizona, and Hawaii's PANSS-STARRS-1. Their job? Take as many photos of Apophis as possible to give NASA images with plenty of reference points. These images, taken several minutes apart, show Apophis in motion relative to the stars and galaxies that the telescopes usually capture. Those stars and galaxies are fixed. Their position is the same in all of the images. Using them as markers, it's easy for NASA to track Apophis as it moves beyond them. Scientists work feverishly with the new images. They don't know what happened. They went through the same process back in 2004, and it showed that the asteroid was going to miss. Attention dwindled. It was drawn to other potential spaceborne threats. But now something had changed Apophis's course, and the data confirms NASA's fears. It's going to hit the Earth. Day 3. NASA knows that the asteroid is coming. Bill Nelson, the 14th NASA administrator and head of the group since May 2021, now instructs his people to tell him exactly what the planet is going to be dealing with. What does the asteroid look like? How fast is it moving? When and where will it hit Earth? The data comes back quickly. Apophis is shaped similarly to a peanut and as wide as the Empire State Building is tall, measuring at about 1,110 feet across. It's a stony construct that NASA believes is comprised primarily of silicate materials with some nickel and iron thrown in. As for when it'll hit, NASA already knows the date, April 13, 2029. That gives Earth 300 days to prepare for the impact and hopefully divert Apophis. Further calculations reveal an impact location, and it's good and bad news. Apophis isn't going to hit land. It will instead plunge into the Atlantic Ocean at around 45,000 miles per hour, faster than anything ever produced on Earth. Day 4. Armed with this new data, Nelson has only one man to call: the President of the United States. A meeting is set up, including Nelson, the President, and both men's leading advisors. The President asks for details, and Nelson provides them. Apophis is over 1,000 feet wide. It's heading to Earth. It's going to touch down in the Atlantic, 15 miles off the coast of Florida. The President wants to know more. What happens when Apophis hits? First, the good news: Apophis is a large asteroid, but it's not a planet killer. Apophis won't represent an extinction-level event, but it will still be lethal. According to NASA's calculations, the asteroid will strike the Earth with the equivalent force of 1,000 megatons of TNT. That's 19.2 times more than Tsar Bomba, a 57 megaton nuclear bomb that is the largest ever created. That bomb was around 10 times more potent than the combined munitions used during the entirety of World War II. So what you're telling me, the President says, is that this asteroid is going to strike Earth with the power of 192 World War IIs? In a manner of speaking, Nelson replies, you could also look at it as being the equivalent to most of our nuclear arsenal all hitting at once in a single location. But it's not a planet killer. The President takes solace in that until he realizes what Nelson was telling him. Apophis will hit just 15 miles from Florida. That means the President can't rely on the massive waves generated to dissipate before they hit the coast. That water is going to hit land. What happens to Florida? The President asks. Nelson shakes his head before continuing. Apophis landing in the ocean will trigger tsunamis measuring hundreds of meters high. Florida will be devastated. Any coastal cities caught in those tsunamis will be wiped out entirely. But even more worrying for Earth is that the impact will release enormous amounts of water vapor in the air, potentially having a massive impact on the planet's climate. We'll worry about that later, the President says. For now, we need to come up with a plan. In the meantime, NASA is communicating with several of its asteroid monitoring partners, including the European Space Agency and the UN-approved International Asteroid Warning Network, or IAWN. Together, those organizations will have to devise a plan to try and send the asteroid off course. Day 20. NASA has its plan. On November 24, 2021, NASA, in collaboration with SpaceX, launched the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART. The goal was simple: fire a rocket at an asteroid to see if the kinetic impact generated by the collision could throw the asteroid off course. The test was a success in relative terms. The target was a moonlit asteroid named Dimorphos. Measuring 525 feet in diameter, around half of that of Apophis, the asteroid was orbiting a parent asteroid named Didymos. NASA's measurements told it that Dimorphos took 11 hours and 55 minutes to orbit its parent before its strike. By the time NASA's rocket reached it on September 26, 2022, it was traveling at 14,000 miles per hour. The rocket struck successfully, and NASA's measurements showed that it had an impact on Dimorphos. The moonlet's orbit time was reduced to 11 hours and 23 minutes, suggesting that the impact had brought Dimorphos closer to its parent asteroid. An orbital change had been achieved, but it wasn't the sort of orbital change that NASA wanted to see in the context of a potential Earth-striking event. The goal is to send Apophis farther away, not bring it closer. Still, NASA had no other options. It's not even sure DART will work to change Apophis' trajectory at all. The organization would have preferred to have several years of testing in the bank before trying a DART launch. It has 283 days. Nelson picks up the phone and calls Elon Musk, the owner of SpaceX. Day 25. Musk has been informed of the situation. NASA wants to use one of his Falcon Heavy rockets to strike an asteroid that's on a collision course with Earth. He's managed to resist the urge to spread the news on X at NASA's insistence, and he's given the okay for the rocket to be launched. Why did NASA want Falcon Heavy? Musk's rocket is capable of generating a staggering 5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff and is one of Earth's most powerful rockets. It can weigh up to 64 metric tons, giving it the weight needed to significantly impact Apophis. It's capable of hitting Apophis at over 10,000 miles per hour. The good news for NASA is that Musk has one of his rockets ready to go. It'll take several days to transport the Falcon Heavy to Cape Canaveral and several more to conduct checks and prepare it for launch. After that, all that remains is to launch and hope. Day 40, Launch Day. The good news is that NASA and SpaceX have done this before. In 2020, the two cooperated on the launch of the first Falcon Heavy rocket, so they knew the drill. SpaceX crews have spent the last few days maneuvering the 230-foot-tall rocket onto its launch position at Kennedy Space Center's Pad 39A, the same pad from which SpaceX launched its first Falcon Heavy, and the math has been completed. Apophis is still 284 million miles away from Earth. However, that might seem like a vast distance. Remember that the asteroid is traveling at 45,000 miles per hour. It's making up distance fast, traveling 1,080,000 miles per day, giving Earth about 263 days before the collision. NASA has to calibrate Falcon Heavy's launch trajectory carefully. It's not anywhere near as fast as Apophis, meaning that the organization has to hit the point where the asteroid will be rather than launch it straight at it. With the Falcon Heavy moving at 10,000 miles per hour, it's going to take days after the launch before it hits. Those are days that NASA can ill afford. Every lost day is another million miles closer to Earth, and there's less of a chance of Falcon Heavy diverting its target. And there are going to be a lot of lost days. The classic math puzzle involving two trains traveling toward each other shows precisely how many. With the total distance between Apophis and Earth being 284 million, the speeds of both the asteroid and the Falcon Heavy rocket are added together. 284 million divided by 55,000 miles per hour means it'll take a touch over 5,163 hours for the rocket to meet the asteroid. That's just over 215 days. By that point, Apophis will have traveled around 232 million miles, leaving it just 52 million miles away from Earth. The success of the plan seems unlikely. Even when Falcon Heavy hits, NASA can't know exactly how much of an impact it'll have and whether that impact will be capable of diverting Apophis. But the launch is the only hope. T-minus 10, 9, 8. Nelson, observing the launch from Mission Control, closes his eyes and whispers a silent prayer to himself. Sitting in the Oval Office with a direct link to Mission Control, the president does the same. Even Elon Musk takes a moment to contemplate the implications of his rocket not being up to the task. 7, 6, 5. Mission Control is enveloped in a heavy silence. All it can do now is hope the launch is successful and its calculations are correct. 4, 3, 2. Here it comes. Earth's one great hope. 1. Liftoff. Falcon Heavy's 27 Merlin engines roar to life, producing the thrust of 18 Boeing 747 aircraft. The rocket lifts into the sky and flies upward. Mission Control checks every speck of data coming back from the craft. Everything is normal. The rocket keeps going, finally leaving Earth's atmosphere and adjusting its trajectory to put it on course with Apophis. The launch was successful. All NASA, Musk, and SpaceX and the president can do from here is wait to see if it works. But in the meantime, the president has an important job on his hands, telling the US people, and by extension the whole world, that an asteroid is on its way. Day 50. The president stands behind a podium in the James S. Brady Press Briefing Room located on the West Terrace of the White House. Behind him stand Bill Nelson, Elon Musk, and a small collective of the president's advisors. The journalists in the room are confused. They don't know why they're here. Everyone knows that NASA and SpaceX collaborated to launch a rocket 10 days ago, but as far as anybody in that room is concerned, the launch was just another test. Still, it is strange that NASA was so quiet about it in the days leading up to the launch. Before the briefing, the president had been in intense debate with his advisors. He knows that he needs to tell the American people what's coming. The question was simple: when? Some of his advisors argue that telling people now, when there are still over 250 days before the asteroid hits, would only result in a mass panic. Others told him that they could use that time to get organized. With 250 days, the US can handle a mass evacuation of Florida and the other coastal regions that could be hit by the tsunamis the asteroid will generate. It can prepare for the worst-case scenario, the Falcon Heavy failing to divert Apophis, rather than waiting until there are just 48 days to handle evacuation orders. Besides, it's only a matter of time before the people start to spot Apophis with telescopes, and there's always the chance that one of those people might figure out the asteroid is on a collision course with Earth. It's better to be open now and start organizing relief and evacuation efforts than leave everything to the last minute. The president agrees with the latter group, which is why he finds himself standing in front of a crowded press room, waiting for the initial hustle and bustle to die down. He starts speaking into the microphone. On June 15, 2028, NASA's observations of the Apophis asteroid revealed that its initial calculations, which stated the asteroid would pass by Earth, were incorrect. A hush of anticipation fills the room. Some of the journalists already anticipate what the president is going to say. Looks of silent horror break out over their faces as the press conference continues. Apophis is currently on course to strike Earth on April 13, 2029. NASA's calculations suggest that the point of impact will be in the Atlantic Ocean, just 12 miles from the Florida coast. The president continues. He explains what will happen upon impact. Florida will be devastated, as will Cuba and the Bahamas. Mexico and Louisiana will also feel the impact of the tsunamis the asteroid creates. But the United States has a plan. The president describes the real reason for the launch of the Falcon Heavy 10 days prior. He concludes his speech and welcomes questions. They come in droves. Why didn't you tell us before? We needed time to prepare plans for attempting to divert the asteroid and evacuating Florida. What about the rest of the world? Have you spoken to other leaders? I have. The relevant people in Cuba, the Bahamas, and anywhere that will be affected by the impact have been informed and are making their own plans. NASA has been cooperating with the IAWN and the European Space Agency, along with other partners. Together, they formulated this plan. My priority is to evacuate Florida so we can minimize the impact Apophis has should our diversion plan fail. Question after question. The president's head is spinning, but he makes it through the press conference. By tomorrow, the whole world will know what's coming. Sitting in the Oval Office, he takes a moment to reflect on what just happened. Did he make the right call? Day 51. Killer asteroid to wipe out Florida. The headline is bleak, sensationalist, and repeated by practically every news outlet in the world. Social media is abuzz. The entire world is in panic. But the president is only focused on one thing: developing Florida's evacuation plan. It's something he's been working on since he learned of the asteroid, along with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. He's also been communicating with Florida's governor, who was newly elected in 2026 after Ron DeSantis left office. Together, they've come up with a plan to reveal rolling evacuation orders for Florida's many counties, with the goal being to break the orders down over the next 200 days. Websites will be used, including floridadisaster.org and Alert Florida, to deliver the evacuation orders, with the president also committing to a weekly news conference focused on the evacuation. The first of those conferences happens today. The president relays the plan to the American people, addressing Floridians specifically. He highlights the evacuation is necessary, even with the small hope that the Falcon Heavy mission will succeed. Massive shelters have already been created in Middle America, which can house those leaving Florida if they have nowhere else to go. The plan is in place. All the president can do now is execute the plan, evacuating Florida county by county over the next 200 days, while hoping that the people listen. Day 52 to day 252. If only the evacuation plans had gone as smoothly as the president hoped. Panic naturally ensued in the wake of the asteroid announcement, with many Floridians jumping the gun and trying to flee the state before they received official evacuation orders. The first few weeks were chaotic. Traffic lined the highways for miles, with car after car packed with families and everything those families could carry. For the first 3 weeks, the president appeared on television almost daily to reiterate the plan and encourage calm. He pointed out that everybody trying to leave at once was making it impossible to organize relief efforts. Slowly, his message started to get through. After about a month, Floridians realized a plan was in place and started following the instructions they received, well, most of them. The president's tactic of appearing on television and delivering orders directly worked well. However, social media was still a scourge during this time. Many raised questions about the order of the evacuation. Small parts of Florida's population questioned the existence of the asteroid at all. Rumblings about control started to surface, and the more conspiratorially minded among the population elected to stay. The president could do little about them. All the while, he'd been handling questions from other world leaders. Indignation about not including them in the SpaceX launch was often high on the agenda, and the president understands these sentiments. But he also notes to every leader he speaks to that the United States is, and always has been, in the best position to deal with the threat. What's more, Apophis is set to touch down on American territory. Yes, the rest of the world will be affected, but it's Florida that will absorb the brunt of the impact, and that had to be his priority. Still, the evacuation went about as well as he could hope. By day 252, Florida is about 95% evacuated. There are still stragglers, people who won't leave because they still don't believe the asteroid is coming, or because they simply don't want to leave home, even if their home is going to be obliterated should the rocket fail. All the president and the rest of the world can do now is wait. In 3 days, Falcon Heavy hits Apophis. Day 255. Impact Day. Bill Nelson, like everybody else in NASA, is watching the Falcon Heavy closely. The data is streaming in, the rocket is still on course. Any moment now, it'll hit Apophis and, hopefully, Do so with enough impact to push the asteroid off course. The moment comes. Falcon Heavy hits Apophis traveling at around 10,000 miles per hour, with a massive explosion resulting. More data comes flying in. Once the dust has cleared, NASA will need a couple of days to analyze the new photographs and check the asteroid's trajectory. Day 258. The data is in. Using photos from the telescopes in Tucson and Hawaii, NASA has confirmed that Apophis's course has changed ever so slightly, but it wasn't enough. Though the impact of the rocket changed the asteroid's trajectory, it's still going to hit the Earth. But now, the problem is worse. It's not going to touch down in the Atlantic. It's going to hit Miami. Nelson grabs the phone and calls the president. This new impact will be different than the one they anticipated. When it strikes on land, Apophis will unleash the power of hundreds of nuclear weapons in one go. NASA anticipates the impact will destroy Miami, with that destruction spreading for several hundred miles in all directions. The asteroid will also kick up masses of dust into the atmosphere. That still has the potential to create severe effects on the climate, with global cooling becoming a possibility. Nelson also informs the president of the possibility that the kinetic energy created by the impact could still cause tsunamis, though they would at least move away from the United States. It could also lead to earthquakes, hurricanes, and other potentially devastating weather effects in its aftermath. The president hangs up the phone and immediately calls another press briefing to deliver the news. There's nothing more he can do. Florida simply has to brace for impact, with the president hoping that the measures he's taken are enough and that the immediate impact will be localized to Florida. Day 300. Apophis is clearly visible to the naked eye. Some of the remaining Floridians stand their ground. They still believe NASA is lying to them and they refuse to leave. Others panic, getting on the road and driving as far away as possible. Hopefully they'll get far enough away to survive. Day 303. Apophis strikes. Using Neil.Fun's asteroid launcher simulator, we can anticipate what the impact would look like. Apophis hits Miami at a speed of about 21 kilometers per second, with the impact angle being about 45 degrees. The asteroid creates a crater that's over 1,500 feet deep and 1.3 miles wide. The impact releases more energy than a hurricane can generate over an entire day and creates a tsunami that leaves Florida around 1,000 feet tall. Those massive waves hit the Bahamas and Cuba. The fireball it creates is even more devastating. Measuring 6.8 miles wide, it can set clothes on fire anywhere within 26 miles of impact, with all the trees that are 54 miles away from the impact zone immediately going up in flames. Were it not for the president's evacuation efforts, millions of people would have died in this fireball, with many millions more receiving third or second degree burns from it. Then comes the shockwave. Anybody who's within about 20 miles of the impact will receive substantial lung damage, with those standing 25 miles or less from the impact zone experiencing ruptured eardrums. Large structures within a 44-mile radius collapse due to the pressure generated by the shockwave. Smaller homes are less sturdy. All within 59 miles are destroyed, with homes outside of that immediate blast zone likely being extremely compromised. It doesn't get much better for them. The impact also generates devastating winds, with all winds within 13 miles of the impact zone being faster than the worst storms in Jupiter. At their peak, the winds will hit 14 kilometers per second, roughly equivalent to 31,300 miles per hour. Anywhere within 38.5 miles of the impact will experience winds that are equivalent to those generated by an F5 tornado or higher. Any trees that somehow survived the fireball will be knocked down, as will any surviving homes that are within 21 miles of the impact. Finally, the asteroid generates an earthquake. Measuring 5.4 on the Richter scale, the earthquake will be felt up to 14 miles from the impact zone. Miami is devastated. Several smaller towns surrounding the city experience the same fate, with the many environmental impacts Apophis generates doing untold damage to structures outside the city. Anybody unfortunate enough to still be in Miami is burnt, torn up by winds, and vaporized before they know what's happening. Day 304 and beyond. It's not safe for rescue teams to enter Florida yet. It won't be for many more days, but the president is still busy organizing relief efforts to be sent in as soon as possible, while NASA analyzes the environmental impact of the strike. Miami is gone, so too are many of the surrounding towns. But the state as a whole isn't destroyed. It'll take years of rebuilding and extensive structural surveys to determine the safety of buildings that weren't destroyed. Miami may never be habitable again, but the world as a whole has survived the Apophis asteroid strike, and now it's much more alert to the possibility of another strike in the future. One thing is for sure, if it hopes to use DART, it'll need to do so with more powerful rockets and with much more time on the clock. And so ends our video on what might happen if a giant asteroid, specifically one that we know will pass close to Earth in a few years, actually hits. The reality is that Apophis is far from the largest asteroid that could strike Earth. Any that are multiple miles wide could be planet-ending. A tornado is a rapidly rotating column of air that is in contact with both the surface of the Earth and the stormy clouds above. This fierce windstorm is often referred to as a whirlwind or a twister. Most tornadoes are found in the Great Plains of the central United States because it's an ideal environment for the formation of severe thunderstorms. In this area, known as Tornado Alley, storms are caused when dry, cold air moving south from Canada meets warm, moist air traveling north from the Gulf of Mexico. Tornadoes are hugely destructive forces of nature. If you find yourself face to face with one, quick thinking is needed. In this episode of the Infographics Show, we'll attempt to work out what is the safest place during a tornado. On August 3rd of this year, 12-year-old Haley and her 10-year-old brother Hunter Oleshak were among 40 people who huddled in the basement of their grandparents' home near Margaret Bruce Beach, while an F4 tornado tore across the property on its way to Lake Manitoba. The power of a tornado is categorized on the Fujita Tornado Intensity Scale, or F scale, with ratings of F1 to F5, 5 being the most destructive. The F4 that these two children survived is considered devastating, with winds between 207 and 260 miles per hour. The tornado that hit the Alonsa area killed one man, 77-year-old Jack Furry, and destroyed several homes, trailers, vehicles, and farm structures. It also destroyed an outbuilding on the Oleshak property. CNBC News reported that both Hunter and Haley saw and heard the twister as it chewed its way across the RM area of Alonsa. They said that they spent their time in the basement of their home, huddled under a mattress, placed there by their dad just in case a tree fell on the house, Hunter said. So in this case, it looks like a mattress acted as a good safety cover for young Haley and Hunter. What other recommendations are out there if you find yourself in the heart of a tornado? Oklahoma is located in Tornado Alley, and so there's no better place to seek advice than from the website of the Oklahoma Emergency Medical Services Authority, or EMSA. Here's the advice they give on the safest places to be during a tornado. In terms of how much time you have to play with, if a tornado has been spotted by the weather radar, you need to seek shelter immediately. A basement or storm shelter underground is by far the safest place to be, but you may not have time to reach one, in which case you'll need to improvise and find the safest place possible. If you're at home when the storm hits, here's the advice. 1. If you have a cellar, storm shelter, safe room, or basement available, go immediately to that area. If none of these options are available to you, then you should get to the lowest level of your home. 2. Find the nearest windowless interior room, such as a bathroom, closet, or inner hallway. 3. Stay as far away from windows as possible. They'll shatter when the storm hits. 4. Go to the center of the room. Corners tend to attract debris. 5. Get under a sturdy piece of furniture, heavy table or desk, or hold onto it, or a mattress if one is available. 6. And protect your head and neck with a blanket if possible. That's the advice if you live in a bricks and mortar house. But what if you live in a mobile home? Mobile homes are particularly vulnerable to tornadoes. Even if they've been anchored down, they can still be easily overturned by the strong swirling winds. If you're in a mobile home when a tornado is approaching, evacuate the home immediately. 1. If possible, find the nearest building with a strong foundation and take shelter there. 2. If a shelter is not available, lie in a ditch or low-lying area a safe distance away from the mobile home. 3. Use your arms to protect your head and neck. 4. Stay alert to the potential for flooding. If you're at work or school, 1. Go to the basement or an inside hallway at the lowest level. 2. Avoid places with wide-span roofs, such as auditoriums, cafeterias, gymnasiums, large hallways, or shopping malls. 3. Get under a sturdy piece of furniture such as a desk or a heavy table. 4. Use your arms to protect your head and neck. If you're in a vehicle, never try to outrun a tornado. Tornadoes can change direction quickly, and a car is no match for the strong tornado gusts and can be tossed through the air. Get out of the vehicle immediately and take shelter in a nearby building. And if there's no time to take shelter, then use the same advice when stranded outside. Lie in a ditch or low-lying area. Use your arms to protect your head and neck, and stay alert to the potential for flooding. Those are a few suggestions on how to protect yourself if a tornado hits, but it's also sensible to be as prepared as you can. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, the best way to stay safe during a tornado is to have the following items on hand. fresh batteries, and a battery-operated TV, radio, or internet-enabled device to listen to the latest emergency weather information, a tornado emergency plan, including access to a safe shelter for yourself and for people with special needs, an emergency kit including water, non-perishable food, and medication, and a list of important information, including telephone numbers, and of course, it's always sensible to be aware of the weather conditions, as well as keeping an eye on the sky. If you know thunderstorms are expected, stay tuned to a local radio and TV station. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, or NOAA, there is no guaranteed safety during a tornado. Even the possibility of a tornado must be taken seriously. In 2016, the tornado season claimed the lives of 18 individuals and injured another 325. 78% of those victims were in a mobile home or trailer park at the time of the tornado. These storms caused an estimated $183 million in property damage. Although the most violent tornadoes can level and blow away almost any house and those within it, extremely violent F5 tornadoes are very rare, and most tornadoes are much weaker. NASA has just found an asteroid on a collision course with Earth. There isn't much time, and if something's not done, millions of people could die. Ideas about what to do are frantically discussed. Should we use a nuke to blow up the asteroid? Or maybe we could push it off course using a spacecraft. But will any of this work? And if it doesn't, what'll happen to planet Earth? This was a very real scenario at the International Academy of Astronautics Planetary Defense Conference. Every 2 years, this conference is held, and scientists from around the world participate in the asteroid drill. Most years, the asteroid could be diverted from its course, and Earth would be saved. But this time, things were different. This was the first time the asteroid was discovered with only months for scientists to plan a way to stop it, instead of years. Could it be done? Could scientists save our planet and countless lives from the dangers of the asteroid? This scenario does not have a happy ending. The details of the asteroid impact scenario were designed by the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and they did not make it easy. Although it's all hypothetical, it could become a reality at any point in time. That's why scientists and astronomers practice dealing with an incoming asteroid relatively frequently. However, this time things were a little more tricky. On April 26, the scientists learned of the incoming asteroid. The early detection systems had not picked up the dangerous space rock until it was only a few months away from hitting our planet. Originally, when the asteroid was spotted, the chances of it hitting the Earth were unclear. It wasn't until new data came in that the scientists discovered that in just under 6 months, the asteroid would smash into our planet, causing massive amounts of destruction. The asteroid itself was approximately 100 feet long and 200 feet wide. After the calculations were checked and rechecked, the asteroid was given a 1 in 20 chance of striking the Earth on October 20th of this year. If the asteroid was going to hit Earth, it was not yet clear where exactly the impact would be. However, everyone was still holding their breath that the rogue space rock would safely pass us by, as 6 months would not be enough time to launch effective countermeasures. Then, a week later on May 2nd, the scientists received the worst possible news. They were now 100% certain the asteroid was going to hit the Earth. The final data had been collected and the numbers had been crunched. It was inevitable. On October 20th, the asteroid would slam into our planet, and unless the scientists of NASA did something quickly, millions of lives would be lost. At this point, the scientists had narrowed down the impact location to somewhere in North Africa or Europe. With such short notice, was there any way scientists could stop the asteroid? Everyone in the room frantically began writing down calculations. People shouted at one another to check on available launch sites and technology. It was a mad dash to figure out how to stop the asteroid and save the lives of countless people. As more and more ideas were presented and cut down by lack of time or resources, things began to look grim. The asteroid was coming, and it seemed like there was nothing the human species could do about it. The scientists scrambled to come up with any viable option. A contingency plan was put in place to start evacuating people immediately. However, the uncertainty of the exact impact location put the amount of people that needed to be moved at unreachable levels. Scientists narrowed down which missions might be able to stop the asteroid impact, or at least collect more data on the object. Suddenly, new information came in. There was good news and bad news. The good news was the impact site had been narrowed down, which would allow for evacuation efforts to become more focused. The bad news, the asteroid was going to hit somewhere inside a populated region of Central Europe. This meant a lot of people would need to be relocated, and there might not be enough time to get them all out. The impact site was calculated to be just south of Prague, putting parts of the Czech Republic, Germany, and Austria in the blast zone. The time to launch a mission was now. Yet, was there anything really that NASA NASA and other space agencies could do in such a short time? It seemed unlikely, but they had to try. It was time to take drastic measures. A plan to use nuclear devices to damage the asteroid and knock it off course was presented. The scientists ran the calculations of how powerful the explosion would have to be to disrupt the asteroid and found that they could only make very general predictions. The problem was they didn't know the exact composition of the asteroid and therefore couldn't calculate its density and mass. This would lead to too many uncertainties. If the nuclear explosion was too small, it wouldn't knock the asteroid off course. If it was too big, it could cause the asteroid to break apart, sending hundreds of smaller space rocks on a collision course with our planet. This could mean multiple locations around the world would be hit and could cause even more damage and loss of life. On the other hand, if they were able to load a rocket with enough nuclear explosives to vaporize the asteroid, then the problem could be solved. However, the uncertainty of the composition of the asteroid made this proposal too risky. But the main problem was time. There just wasn't enough time to prep and launch a spacecraft that could reach the asteroid and deploy its payload. In reality, a mission of this magnitude would require several years of planning. The scientists estimated the very quickest turnaround time for a nuclear mission to be successful would be 2 years. Unfortunately, they didn't have 2 years. They only had months before impact. The nuclear option was now off the table. It would seem there was nothing left to do except wait for the asteroid to hit the Earth. However, one group of scientists suggested that if they could gather more data, they'd be able to save more lives. Their plan was to launch a recon mission to find out about the asteroid. The more data they had, the better plan they could create. The more people they could evacuate and save. This mission could be launched within a short time frame, as they already had exploratory spacecraft prepped for launch. In this scenario, the recon mission gathered data and determined the diameter of the object within 10% accuracy. Now the scientists knew the asteroid was 118 meters in diameter, plus or minus 12 meters. This substantially narrowed down the actual area that would be damaged by the impact. Now the evacuation efforts could focus on a smaller area and save more lives. The final conclusion of the scientists was that there was no way to stop the incoming asteroid. But by launching the recon mission, they could save many more lives using more precise data. This was the best case scenario given the technology we have today. It's a sobering thought that there could have been an asteroid on a collision course with Earth at this very moment, and we just haven't discovered it yet, and that this scenario could become very real very quickly. The scientists determined that with the infrastructure and spacecraft we have today, a mission to stop an asteroid with such short notice would not be possible. This prompted a discussion on why it's so important to improve our rapid launch capabilities, because if this scenario happened in real life, the asteroid would wipe out everything in a 100-kilometer diameter of the impact site. Even though both the recon mission and the nuclear strike could have reduced the destruction caused by the asteroid, neither would have had enough time to be 100% effective using the technology and infrastructure we have today. NASA's been working on early detection systems for a while now, and many asteroids have already been found and are being tracked. For ones we've already located, we'll have plenty of warning if they're going to come near Earth. However, we can't plan for random collisions that alter the course of the asteroids, which may knock one into our path with very little warning. We also can't detect asteroids that could pass through our solar system from interstellar space. These types of asteroids are uncommon, but it's not impossible that someday they might be suddenly on a collision course with Earth. It's estimated that for even a small asteroid, we would need years in order to plan, launch, and nudge the space rock off its trajectory toward our planet. If we only have months to figure out a way to stop an asteroid as of right now, there is nothing we can do but wait for it to hit our planet. This scenario did, however, show that there were several ways to at least mitigate the casualties from an asteroid impact. As the asteroid gets closer and more data is gathered, we have the means to calculate where the asteroid will hit with a reasonable amount of accuracy. This would allow us to focus our resources on evacuating as many people as possible in that specific area, instead of trying to spread out our resources across the globe due to uncertainty. Mitigating casualties is not the best case scenario, but right now, it's the best we can do if an asteroid were to hit the Earth with little warning. Later in 2021, NASA will launch the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART mission, which will lay the groundwork for future missions to deflect asteroids off a collision course with our planet. However, these types of missions are brand new, and therefore we still need a lot of time to refine the technology and procedures necessary for successfully moving asteroids with the technology. The way DART works is that the spacecraft slams into a small asteroid, causing the path of the space rock to shift slightly. If this is done far enough in advance, then even a small push would be enough to knock the asteroid off course. NASA is also planning on launching the Near-Earth Object Surveillance mission in the mid-2020s. This new satellite will scour the solar system for yet-to-be-discovered asteroids that may one day pose a threat to our planet. The idea is to prevent any surprise emergencies like the one that was conducted at the International Academy of Astronautics Planetary Defense Conference. With enough warning time, we could shift an asteroid's trajectory even using the technology we have today, but time is key. We need a lot of it in order to be successful. We're talking years or even decades of advance notice would be needed. The key takeaways from the asteroid impact scenario from the International Academy of Astronautics Planetary Interplanetary Defense Conference are that we need to invest more in our space program and technology. It's not a matter of if an asteroid will ever be on a collision course with Earth, but when. We will have to save our planet from an asteroid impact at some point. As of right now, if we don't have years of lead time to launch a mission to push an asteroid off its collision course with Earth, it will hit us, and there is no way of stopping it. Today's subject comes from a viewer suggestion. YouTube user Kalari wonders just how big a rogue wave can get. Rogue waves, also called monster waves or freak waves, are the mysterious phenomenon of a single swell on the water rising up to dangerous proportions. They can be especially strong in stormy conditions, but a rogue wave is possible even when the weather is favorable. To understand why they're such a terror, consider this scene, suggested by one survivor of a rogue wave encounter. You're on the deck near the bow of a cruise ship, leaning over the railing on a cool but sunny summer day in the Arctic Barents Sea. You can just see the outline of snowy mountains along the Norwegian coast in the far distance if you turn to look over your shoulder. Off the ship's port side, the waves are high, but the sky is clear and the course is smooth. Over the course of a few seconds, though, you see something strange develop, like a hill sprouting out from the surface of the water. One wave rises into a ridge as if trying to see over its neighbors until it really sticks out far above the pack. It begins to break into whitecaps as it nears the ship. You realize it's time to run, and so you don't see the moment it hits, but you'll always remember the feeling of being thrown to the deck and seeing supplies, glass, and furniture flying, all to the sound of a crash that seems to come from every direction at once. It turns out the ship can handle this kind of strike, but a little notice would have helped. You have no idea how the other passengers fared. Even under calm conditions, waves near the shore can still reach monstrous size. Pro surfers at beaches like Nazaré, Portugal, take on swells in excess of 80 feet, thanks to an offshore canyon that concentrates the wave energy. But on the open ocean, the conventional wisdom used to be that the physics of wind, water, and gravity limited ordinary waves to about 30 feet, with 50-foot waves occasionally whipping up in the most extreme weather. Tsunamis, which are caused by earthquakes, volcanoes, and landslides, were an exception, with the splash height from a falling rock reaching especially high, although even tsunamis can appear deceptively small until they approach land. Modern earthquake detection doesn't eliminate the threat from tsunamis, but it does provide some warning. A rogue wave is something else entirely. By definition, it seems not to fit the prevailing wave conditions, spiking to 3 to 6 times the height of neighboring waves, without a clear explanation for the abrupt change. Mathematical modeling used to emphasize the familiar uniformity of waves in a series, predicting an outlier the size of a rogue wave anywhere in the world once every 10,000 years. More current models demonstrate much greater variety in wave size. This doesn't really register much if the ocean conditions are calm to begin with, since a single 10-foot wave among a series of 5-foot waves will have no effect on a vessel of any significant size. On the other hand, if conditions are stormy and the seas are already high and choppy, an unexpected tripling or even sextupling of wave height could be deadly. Extreme weather, difficult working conditions, and sometimes grueling activities have always made the lives of professional seafarers precarious. Working in commercial shipping is the second deadliest occupation in the world, while the most dangerous is deep-sea fishing. There are 85,000 large ships plying on the waters of the world, carrying goods, resources, and people. On average, at least one of those vessels wrecks every 2 weeks. One insurance company puts the tally much higher, at 2 major shipwrecks every week. Of those, about 1 per year is never located, leaving the mind free to imagine all manner of extreme explanations, both possible and fanciful, such as piracy or spontaneous levitation into outer space. Rogue waves were once on the list of fantastical explanations between Poseidon's wrath and sea monster attacks, but are now well documented as one of the many hazards ships face at sea. Only in 1995 did hard evidence of rogue waves start coming to light. On January 1st of that year, a laser sensor on the Dropner oil rig in the North Sea detected a lone wave 85 feet tall amid a field of 39-foot waves. Still huge, but well below 50% of the standout, and far higher than the 50-foot limit such rigs were built to handle. Then, in February 1995, the ocean liner Queen Elizabeth II encountered a 95-foot wave, which the captain compared to the cliffs of Dover. Research into rogue waves now seems to make sense. A 1997 analysis on an earlier body of data from Denmark's Gorn oil field uncovered a history of 466 rogue waves in a span of 12 years. The European Space Agency scrutinized 30,000 satellite images looking at 18 square-mile blocks of ocean over the course of 3 weeks in 2001. In that time span, they discovered 10 rogue waves of 82 feet or higher, some as high as 100 feet. Their report, released in 2004, showed that while monster waves were exceptional, they were a lot more common than 1 in every 100 centuries. The data indicated that rogue waves may be especially common in areas of strong ocean currents, such as the Algulas Current in the Indian Ocean off of South Africa. Confronted with an approaching monster wave, a ship's captain will, time permitting, steer straight into it. This is neither a suicidal impulse nor an attack strategy born out of a stress-induced delusion that the wave is a real monster, and banging it with the ship's prow is the only chance at stopping it. The leading tip of the ship is the angle best suited to cutting through water, whereas a sidelong blow carries both a greater risk of structural damage and capsizing the vessel. Don't cancel your next cruise just because of rogue waves. When scientists say they're more common than previously believed, that's a relative statement. Your odds of getting hit by a monster on any given cruise are still incredibly low. Some data indicates that rogue waves actually may be getting less frequent, although the same study shows that the strength of individual rogue waves may be increasing. As far as records go, a little more than 100 feet seems to be about the record for rogue wave activity. But we've really only just begun monitoring the ocean for rogues, so that maximum is subject to revision. Theoretically, a rogue wave could reach almost 200 feet. Tsunamis are some of the most feared natural phenomena in the world, and there's a good reason why. These large waves of water can wash away and destroy just about anything in their path, including ships, cities, and people. It can also magnify the death and destruction of an already existing catastrophic situation. This is because the driving force behind tsunamis is usually another powerful and potentially destructive phenomenon, such as an earthquake or volcanic eruption. To make matters worse, there are mega tsunamis, which are huge waves that are created in a landslide involving large amounts of dirt and other materials falling into a body of water. While typical tsunamis have a wave height of up to 33 feet, mega tsunamis have significantly higher wave heights that can range from hundreds to even thousands of meters. We'll discuss 10 of the largest and strongest tsunamis of all time in this episode of the Infographics Show, the biggest tsunamis ever. 10. 2011 Tohoku Tsunami. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9 earthquake occurred off the east coast of Japan. A Guardian article described it as the fourth most powerful in the history of seismology. The earthquake was so strong that it knocked the Earth 6.5 inches off its axis. So it's not surprising that the tsunami it created had enormous strength too. Reaching a wave height of 131.2 feet, the tsunami killed 18,000 people and devastated coastal communities. Live Science describes how waves overtopped and destroyed protective tsunami seawalls at several locations, and that the massive surge destroyed 3-story buildings where people had gathered for safety. Another potentially disastrous effect of the tsunami is that it caused a cooling system failure at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which resulted in a level 7 nuclear meltdown. Besides physical damage, the tsunami and earthquake caused great financial damage to Japan as well. The World Bank estimates that the total economic cost could reach up to $235 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in world history. 9. 1883 Krakatoa Tsunamis. The August 1883 volcanic eruption of Krakatoa in what is now Indonesia created a series of powerful tsunamis. NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information states that the largest wave was estimated at 135 feet high. When the tsunamis ended, not much was left on the islands near Krakatoa. Vegetation, homes, and people were washed away by the waves. NOAA estimates that of the 36,000 people who died, 34,000 of them lost their lives due to tsunamis. 8. 1946 Aleutian Island Tsunami. This tsunami was caused by an 8.6 magnitude earthquake that occurred near Unimak Island, one of Alaska's Aleutian Islands. NOAA states that the waves reached as high as 42 meters, or about 138 feet. The tsunami wiped out a lighthouse on Unimak Island and killed its 5 occupants, but there were more casualties. Oddly enough, the tsunami caused more destruction outside of Alaska than in it. Hawaii was the hardest hit. A Live Science article describes how the Hilo waterfront was destroyed and surges as tall as 2- and 3-story buildings pounded several coastal villages. The tsunami killed 159 people in Hawaii and caused $26 million in damage in 1946 dollars. 7. 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami earned a spot on our list because of its tragic trinity of high power, high wave height, and high destruction. The tsunami was caused by the massive Sumatra-Andaman earthquake, which ranged in magnitude between 9.1 and 9.3. National Geographic estimates that the earthquake released the energy of 23,000 Hiroshima-type atomic bombs, and this energy created powerful waves. According to Australian Geographic, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami attained a wave height of almost 164 feet. It decimated coastal areas and was one of the deadliest natural events on record. This tsunami killed about 230,000 people, and Australian Geographic states that it caused an estimated $10 billion in damage. 6. 1771 Great Yaeyama Tsunami. According to NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information, an earthquake with a magnitude of 7.4 shook the Ryukyu Islands in Japan on April 24, 1771. The earthquake did less damage than the tsunami it produced. One source estimates that the wave height of the tsunami at one of the Ryukyu Islands, Ishigaki, ranged between 131.2 to 162.5 feet high, and that the number of dead and missing was 12,000 people. 5. 1792 Mount Unzen Tsunami. Mount Unzen is a group of stratovolcanoes located in southern Japan. On May 21, 1792, the collapse of one of Mount Unzen's lava domes caused a landslide that covered the city of Shimabara before crashing into the Ariake Sea. According to Popular Science, the 1792 collapse caused 300-foot-high waves. The USGS states that this tsunami traveled along the adjacent shorelines of Shimabara Peninsula and 17 to 23 kilometers across the Ariake Sea in neighboring provinces. The USGS calls the 1792 Mount Unzen landslide and tsunami Japan's worst historical volcanic disaster. A total of 15,000 people died, but one source estimates that 10,000 out of the 15,000 deaths were due to the tsunami. Australian Geographic states that the cost of damages to agriculture and fish facilities were estimated at 17.4 billion yen, roughly $150 million. 4. 2017 Greenland Mega Tsunami. On June 17, 2017, part of the Karat Fjord in Greenland gave away, causing a large landslide that cascaded into the ocean. The science journal Nature reports that rocks and other material fell into the water with such force that they generated a seismic signal suggestive of a magnitude 4.1 earthquake and a mega tsunami with a wave height of 328.1 feet. A Daily Mail article states that the waves of this mega tsunami far surpassed the height of those caused by the 2011 tsunami in Japan, and they even sent huge icebergs hurtling ashore. Nature adds that the mega tsunami was strong enough to inundate the small fishing village of Nugatsiak, which is located on an island within the fjord about 20 kilometers away. 11 houses were lost and 4 people were presumed dead. While it did not cause a lot of death and destruction, Nature calls the 2017 Greenland mega tsunami one of the tallest tsunamis in recorded history. 3. Pico de Fogo Mega Tsunami. Approximately 73,000 years ago, Pico de Fogo, a 9,300-foot volcano on one of the Cape Verde Islands, erupted with such force that part of it collapsed and crashed into the sea. A BBC article reports that the impact of the falling debris created a 240-meter tsunami wave that engulfed Santiago Island 34 miles away. It's highly unlikely human lives were lost in this mega tsunami, because the Cape Verde Islands were uninhabited until the mid-1400s. Because no human records are available, scientists reconstructed the effects of the Pico de Fogo mega tsunami on Santiago Island based on geologic evidence. Some of this evidence indicates that it inundated the island up to 900 feet above sea level. According to a Popular Science article, scientist Ricardo Ramalho and his research team were able to confirm through fieldwork and rock dating techniques that huge boulders found on Santiago Island were transported by the tsunami. This was no small feat because these boulders weighed up to 770 tons. According to a Guardian article, Ramalho also speculated that it's highly probable that any or at least most of the flora and fauna within this zone were completely wiped out. 2. 1980 Spirit Lake Mega Tsunami. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, a collapse of the upper top of the mountain caused a huge landslide that sent rocks and debris tumbling into nearby Spirit Lake. The landslide displaced the water in the lake, creating a mega tsunami that was 820 feet high. One source states that this wave height was over 6 times the height of the devastating tsunami unleashed by the Krakatoa eruption in 1883. The damage caused by the mega tsunami was limited to the area close to Spirit Lake. The mega tsunami took out nearby trees and debris and deposited them into the lake. 3 people, 2 amateur volcanologists and a lodge owner, were known to be near Spirit Lake when Mount St. Helens erupted. Most sources presumed they were killed by the landslide and not the mega tsunami. However, what happened to them will probably never be fully known because their bodies were never recovered. 1. 1958 Lituya Bay Mega Tsunami. On June 17, 1958, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake triggered seismic activity along the Fairweather Fault in Alaska. The earthquake caused a landslide. Rocks, dirt, and other materials from slopes near the fault tumbled into a nearby body of water called Lituya Bay, resulting in a mega tsunami. Geologist Don Miller did an aerial inspection of the damage. According to the Alaska Earthquake Center, Miller searched for the trim line, which is the water line that marks the highest point that the tsunami reached, and found it to be 1,720 feet. Below the trim line, the destruction was described as absolute. Miller saw that trees and earth had been stripped away to clean bedrock. However, the loss of human life and property was minimal due to the fact that the mega tsunami swept through a remote area. 5 people died, and a nearby lighthouse, cabin, and mountaineers' campsite were swept away without a trace. A Smithsonian article calls the 1958 Lituya Bay mega tsunami the tallest tsunami ever documented. Tornadoes are one of the deadliest forces of nature on Earth. There are around 1,200 tornadoes reported in the U.S. every single year, almost all of them causing pain, death, and devastation in their wake. Some of those tornadoes can reach wind speeds of over 200 miles per hour, and between 1875 and 2011, over 550 U.S. citizens have been killed by tornadoes. So to be caught in the middle of an active tornado and survive is almost a miraculous feat. Matt Suter is the lucky recipient of one such miracle. Matt Suter was a regular 19-year-old high school senior living in Fordland, Missouri during 2006. On March 12th of that same year, Matt would experience a living nightmare and be lucky to live to tell the tale. He was in a trailer watching TV with his grandmother and uncle when a nightmarish 150-mile-an-hour twister advanced on their position. Typically, if this was happening to you, your best course of action would be to crouch into a crash position and pray to your deity of choice. But Matt hardly even had time to think before all hell broke loose. He was about to understand the plight of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz a whole lot better. When recounting the terrifying ordeal, Matt said that he heard the approaching tornado getting louder and louder, comparing its noise to 10 military jets flying directly at him all at once. The pressure in the mobile home suddenly increased to almost crushing levels as the front and back doors were abruptly ripped off their hinges. Matt said that he could literally see the entire trailer moving under the sheer force of the tornado, even comparing the way the walls quivered from the pressure to jello. This all happened so fast that Matt and his grandparents didn't even realize that a tornado was what they were dealing with. Seconds later, the top of the trailer was torn off like a tin of sardines, and Matt was sucked into the tremendous force of the twister, his screams drowned out by the roar of the intense wind. He was carried away into the darkness of the night toward what seemed like certain death, while his family could only watch in terror from below. The trailer was completely leveled by the incident, burying Matt's grandmother and uncle underneath the rubble. Thankfully, both of them survived with only minor injuries, but they feared the worst for Matt. They saw him carried off into the sky, and most people who undergo that kind of experience don't come back. Linda Kelly, Matt's grandma, wanted to find him, but she was understandably terrified of finding her grandson dead in the aftermath of the twister. But she was wrong to fear. Matt Suter was carried over 1,300 feet, that's 4 football fields in case you had trouble picturing it, by the tornado, before being deposited in the soft grass of an open field. The only injury sustained being a gash on his head from being hit by a flying lamp. He was otherwise, against all odds, completely and utterly intact. When he got up, Matt realized that he'd just been spat out by a tornado, and he made the fair assumption that his grandma and uncle had been killed in the incident. So he immediately ran to his friend's house to seek help. Meanwhile, his grandma and uncle searched for him. Shortly after, Matt and his family reunited in a reunion as heartwarming as it was statistically improbable. Suter's physician, Dr. Ron Buning, remarked that Matt was the luckiest man alive to have survived the incident with only a superficial head wound and some abrasions on the undersoles of his feet. What's even more insane is that because this whole incident transpired in the middle of the night, Matt Suter underwent the whole disaster only wearing his boxer shorts. While he thankfully didn't break any bones, Matt did actually break a world record for his trouble. To this day, Matt Suter holds the record for farthest distance survived in a tornado. The runner-up, in case you're curious, was a 9-year-old girl in Bodle, South Dakota. On July 1, 1955, she and her horse were picked up by a tornado and deposited unharmed 1,000 feet away. That's still around 307 below Matt's record, so for now, his crown is safe. Matt Suter was incredibly lucky to survive being thrown such a massive distance by a tornado, but while his physical injuries have healed, Matt was understandably traumatized by the incident. I mean, who wouldn't be? He has since reported having repeated nightmares about the incident and finds memories of the night consistently occupying his thoughts. He also found the sudden fame of his new record holder status was a little overwhelming, with his phone blowing up with texts and calls after the incident. Matt, a humble and soft-spoken guy, didn't feel suited to all the new attention. Describing his final thoughts on the whole experience, Matt said, "I've always told my girlfriend I wanted to see a tornado, but I sure didn't want to be in one." Matt has since returned to normal life, counting himself lucky for getting another chance. His stated intention after the incident was finishing high school and then joining the United States Marine Corps. If he did indeed follow that ambition, he certainly has one crazy story to share with his fellow Marines. Thanks for watching this episode of The Infographic Show. Want to hear even more crazy stories of people surviving against all odds? Why not check out How Did an 11-Year-Old Survive a Plane Crash and Climb Down a Mountain? An Insane Way a Man Survived 76 Days Lost at Sea, and other incredible survival stories. In the meantime, don't mess with twisters. You probably won't be as fortunate as Matt Suter.